Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the mud, mystery and misfires of the Middle Ages to explore something a little clunky. You ever look at some old object in a museum and think, who thought that was a good idea? Yeah, us too. But here's the kicker. Even the medieval products that completely failed still managed to wriggle their way into the future. Tonight, we're talking iron plows that sank into fields, moats that drowned more friends than enemies, and armour that protected everything except what mattered most. And yet, somehow, you're still using the ghosts of these inventions today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it, no pressure. While you're at it, drop your city and time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing ankle deep in a field that was supposed to be fertile. Supposed to be. You've got calluses on your palms, your ox is giving you side-eye, and the thing you're dragging behind you, the cutting-edge, revolutionary, absolutely promising iron plow, feels less like a breakthrough and more like a punishment. Welcome to the 9th century, where farming is the difference between life and death, and technology is not quite there yet. The early iron plow, or the ard, is supposed to revolutionise agriculture, and in theory it's brilliant. Wood splits, iron doesn't. Wood is weak, iron is strong, except that no one quite accounted for how heavy iron is, especially when you've got to drag it across a soggy field with a reluctant ox and zero suspension. Farmers who switch from the lightweight wooden plough to this beast of a tool often find themselves worse off, struggling to pull the thing through clay-heavy soil. It doesn't slice deep, it sinks, and when it does move, it clumps and clogs with thick muck that needs constant cleaning. But the weirdest part, the idea sticks. The basic concept, dig deeper, plant better, harvest more, catches hold. Sure, the medieval plough might be a fail in practice, but it changes the thinking. Farming shifts from shallow scratching of the surface to deeper, more nutritious turns of the soil. Later versions will evolve, lighten up, and eventually become the tractor's great-great-grandparent. That iron beast, still lurking somewhere in your food chain. Now, here's a quirky twist. Some farmers tried to fix the problem with more oxen. Like, instead of 2, why not 8? The result? A parade of grumpy animals all dragging a still broken tool through fields that hate them. It's chaos. A sort of medieval Fast and Furious, oxen drift. Scholars still debate whether this early iron plough was truly a failure in all regions. Some areas with looser, drier soils may have had better luck. Others argue it wasn't the plough but the lack of infrastructure, no proper roads to transport replacement parts, no understanding of soil compaction. It's the classic tech launch without tech support. Think of it like version 1.0 of an app. Bloated, slow, and crashes under pressure. But hey, it paved the way for 2.0. And there's also a social twist. This plough changes society. Because it's so heavy and hard to use, it encourages communal farming. You need your neighbours. You need their oxen. Suddenly, villages aren't just little family islands. They're networks. Cooperative effort grows out of technological shortfall. You may hate this plough, but you'll love the community dinner afterward. Probably stew, always stew. Imagine yourself trudging through one of those old fields. Mud sucks at your boots, and your shoulders ache from yanking at a tool that feels custom designed to defeat you. The sun beats down, a crow circles, the ox farts. You think to yourself, this has to get better. And weirdly, it does, but not for you. Generations later, your descendants will look back at this very model, laugh a little and say, we still base modern ploughs on that thing, and then they'll hop into an air-conditioned cab with Bluetooth and hydraulics and pretend this part never happened. Still, the persistence of the plough tells us something strange about invention. It doesn't need to work perfectly to survive. It just needs to introduce a concept compelling enough to outlive its own failures. Dig deeper, get more, farm smarter, even if it means ruining your back and breaking your tools in the meantime. Also, small detail, not all iron ploughs were made equally. In some places, blacksmiths cut corners, not because they were lazy, but because iron was stupidly expensive and hard to work with. Some iron plows were actually wood with iron tips. That fell off. Farmers would discover their high-tech tool was just a splinter waiting to happen. It's kind of like buying a phone with a fake camera lens glued on the back. Looks cool, doesn't work. So tonight, as you lie there cosy in your blanket, try to imagine gripping that rough, sweat-slick handle of a plow that's sinking under its own weight. You pull, it resists, you curse. The ox gives up, but the idea pulls forward. And somewhere, hundreds of years later, a sleek John Deere hums across a field under the same principle, except with air conditioning and cup holders. You wake up sore, not from battle or plague or sleeping on straw, but from wearing a full-length metal sweater that's tried to saw your armpits off for 12 hours. That's right, you spent the day dressed in chainmail. You thought it looked cool. Maybe it did, in the first 5 minutes. But after mile 6, one thing is clear. Whoever designed this thing never had to wear it. Chainmail, or mile, if you want to sound fancy at dinner parties, was supposed to be the game-changing armour of its time. Thousands of little iron rings, painstakingly linked together in a pattern so tight it could supposedly stop a sword. It's medieval tech at its most ambitious, and slowest. Each shirt took months to make. Months. You could plant a whole crop, harvest it, bake the bread, and still be waiting for your hauberk. So what happens when knights actually wear it into battle? Well, they sweat. A lot. Mail isn't exactly breathable. It's like wearing a soaking wet rug made of metal mosquito netting. Not to mention, it weighs between 20 and 30 pounds and distributes that weight everywhere. On your shoulders, on your legs, on your soul. It doesn't deflect blunt force, so if someone swings a mace at you, congratulations. You'll survive, but you'll be walking like a medieval crab for the rest of your life. And arrows? Don't get us started. Chainmail was notoriously bad at stopping arrows, especially the longbow, which was kind of the medieval version of bringing a bazooka to a knife fight. Archers would aim for your armpits, groin or eyes, because your fancy mail shirt didn't cover any of those. Oops. Still, somehow this terrible armour caught on, not just for knights either. Even squires and rich merchants started rocking it, probably for the same reason people today wear those absurdly heavy gold chains, to look important. But as weapons got nastier, crossbows, warhammers, pointy little daggers that slid between those iron links, mail started to seem less like protection and more like decoration. So why did it survive? Well, because people loved the idea of being wrapped in armour. Symbolically it felt like invincibility. Practically it was more like a medieval sauna, but it set a design foundation. The interlinked structure of mail inspired later ideas in personal protection, like bulletproof vests made with interwoven fibres, or chain-link fencing that now surrounds everything from prisons to playgrounds. And it also shows up in weird places, like the bite-proof suits worn by people who swim with sharks. Yep, those are made with a modern version of chainmail. Same logic. Small rings, big protection. At least that version doesn't rust on contact with your sweat. Want a quirky fact? There are whole surviving suits of mail from the Middle Ages that have tiny charms woven into them. Little religious medallions or icons hidden in the rings. Like the medieval version of sewing a lucky coin into your boxer shorts. People figured if you're going to get skewered, maybe St. Peter will intercept the arrow. And here's where scholars get messy. Some argue that mail wasn't really about protection at all. It was about class. You weren't wearing it to survive a fight. You were wearing it so people knew you could afford to lose one. Mail became the medieval equivalent of a luxury SUV. Massive, inefficient, overpriced, and totally impractical for real combat. Others insist it was better than we give it credit for, especially in combo with a proper gambeson, a thick padded underlayer that absorbed shock and smelled like fermented armpits. But even as it faded from battlefields, chainmail never really disappeared. It just got recast. Stage actors wear it in Shakespeare plays, LARPers and cosplayers stitch plastic versions for conventions, and metalworkers craft mini versions for jewellery, belts and edgy handbags. What failed on the field thrives on the runway. If you're dozing off, picture this. You trudging into a muddy field, every step squelching under 30 pounds of rust-prone regret. The sky is grey. The enemy has crossbows, and you just realised you forgot to oil your mail last night so it's already stiff. You swing your sword, miss. An arrow zips past your ear. You bend to duck, your mail catches on your own boot, and you somersault straight into a thorn bush. That's your legacy. You're not a war hero, you're a cautionary tale. Yet centuries later, someone's hand-stitching a mini version of your armour for their dachshund. Because nothing says invincible like a dog in chainmail. It's the circle of life, really. The candlelight flickers across a polished slab of something that used to be glass, or at least the medieval version of it. You squint at the warped surface, holding it up to your face, and what you see makes you pause. Is that you? Or a slightly haunted version of you filtered through a layer of fog and distortion? Welcome to the world of early eyeglasses, where the vision correction is barely better than a guess, and wearing them outdoors is basically a dare. It's the 13th century, and someone in Italy has just invented a game changer. Convex lenses mounted on tiny frames you balance on the bridge of your nose. These first spectacles are handmade, fragile, and outrageously expensive. They're mostly for monks, scribes, and anyone rich enough to spend their days reading by firelight instead of tilling mud. But don't imagine these things as sleek, rimless numbers. Nope. They're clunky, awkward discs in crude frames that don't hook behind your ears, don't adjust for fit, and don't stay on your face if you sneeze too hard. And heaven forbid you walk outside with them on. One drop of rain, game over. Early lenses were often made from polished quartz or blown glass with just enough clarity to technically not be blind, but not enough to actually help. They distorted light, cracked easily, and, fun fact, tended to fog up the moment the temperature changed. In an era before anti-fog coatings or microfiber cloths, your only option was to smudge the lens further with your tunic, which, considering hygiene standards, probably made things worse. Still, people loved them. Why? Because for the first time, the aging elite could keep reading, calculating, copying manuscripts, and doing all the other brainy stuff that made them feel superior to everyone else. In fact, early spectacles were so tied to wisdom that portraits started showing scholars wearing them, even if they didn't need them, like medieval Photoshop for intelligence. Of course, these glasses didn't correct for nearsightedness, only farsightedness. So if you were a teenager squinting at birds on the horizon, tough luck. You had to wait a few hundred years for someone to care. And astigmatism? Forget about it. You just saw the world slightly crooked forever. Here's a bizarre twist. Some people in the Middle Ages believed wearing lenses too long might damage your soul. Not your eyes, your soul. Vision, in medieval philosophy, wasn't just a physical process, it was spiritual. The eye took in divine truth, and distorting it with glass could mean you weren't seeing the world as God intended. Wild, right? So picture a monk sliding his specs down his nose with one hand and crossing himself with the other, just in case. And yet, despite being half useless, spectacles caught on. They were copied and modified, traded along merchant routes and tucked into velvet pouches as precious heirlooms. Some had rivets so you could fold them up, sort of. Others were mounted on handles like little monocles you had to hold up to your face manually every time you read a word. Efficiency was not the vibe. Historians argue about who truly invented them. The common credit goes to Salvino da Marte, a 13th century Florentine who may or may not have been real. Others point to unnamed monks tinkering with lenses in northern Italy. What's clear is that by the early 1300s, people across Europe were holding awkward bits of glass up to their eyes and pretending they could see better. And somehow, this awkward ritual evolved into a permanent industry. Fast forward to now. You've got contact lenses, LASIK surgery, progressive bifocals that adjust themselves, and yet eyeglasses remain an iconic symbol of intelligence, style, and just a hint of awkwardness. We still slap glass in front of our faces and call it fashion. Some people who don't need glasses wear them anyway. Aesthetic, darling. And the best part? We still haven't solved the fog problem. Step outside in winter wearing a mask and boom, you've recreated a 13th century optical experience. Congratulations. History repeats, just with better frame options. So now picture it. You, in a medieval scriptorium, candlelight flickering, hunched over a parchment you can't quite read because your lenses are both too weak and covered in soot. You nudge them up your nose, only for them to slide right back down. A drop of sweat lands on the glass. You wipe it with your sleeve. Smudge City. The abbot walks by and sees you squinting like a mole and says, "Brother, perhaps the Lord wishes you not to finish this manuscript today." You nod solemnly, when really you're just going blind from bad optics, and yet you'd still wear them again. Because even if they're flawed, they give you a glimpse of clarity, a moment where the letters don't blur, a second of crispness in a world of haze. That's all we ever really want, right? It hits your nose first, an unholy mixture of goat fat, ash, and something that might have once been lavender, if lavender had a personal vendetta against your sinuses. Welcome to the world of medieval soap, where cleanliness is less a virtue and more a gamble with your skin, your smell, and quite possibly your soul. In theory, soap is simple. Fat plus lye equals bubbles. But medieval soap makers had a flair for chaos. The lye came from wood ash, soaked in water and filtered through cloth, assuming the cloth was clean, which it wasn't. The fat? Animal remains. Tallow from cows, lard from pigs, sometimes goat fat if you were fancy. Now picture this stewing over a fire for hours, stirred by a man who probably hasn't bathed since Easter. That's your soap. And here's the kicker, it didn't even work that well. Sure, it technically cleaned things, but it also stripped your skin raw, stung your eyes, and left behind a smell somewhere between wet dog and charred bacon. Still, people kept using it. Not daily, of course. This was the Middle Ages, where bathing once a month made you a hygiene influencer. But soap had its place, especially for laundering clothes or scrubbing out the occasional festering wound. Want to clean your tunic? Soap's your guy. Want to clean your soul? Head to church. Now, the upper class had access to something slightly better. Imported Aleppo soap from the Middle East. Made with olive oil and scented with laurel, it was the Chanel number. 5 of medieval hygiene. But it was outrageously expensive, and most people wouldn't dream of wasting it on their actual bodies. Hands, maybe. Special guests, definitely. But full-body baths? That was borderline reckless. There's a strange fringe fact here. Some medieval people believed soap opened the pores, which allowed sickness to get in. So you've got this paradox. The product that should keep you healthy is considered dangerous, while walking around covered in filth is seen as a kind of protective crust. It's like medieval skincare advice written by a raccoon. And you know what? That idea stuck around. During some plague outbreaks, doctors recommended avoiding baths completely. Clean skin was considered exposed skin, so people just didn't. Ever. Fast forward to now. You've got an entire aisle at the grocery store dedicated to soap. Bars, gels, foams, things with exfoliating beads, things that smell like alpine forests or cucumbers that went to therapy. But the process, still the same. Fat plus lye. The stuff that made medieval soap smell like burnt goat now gives us lavender oat swirl. The failures of the past got perfumed, packaged and marketed as luxury. And don't get smug just yet. You've probably used tallow-based soap without realising it. Some artisanal brands proudly return to traditional recipes, minus the grime and plague. Ever bought a heritage or farmhouse bar at a craft fair? Surprise, it's your old goat fat friend now with a rustic label. There's debate among historians about how widespread soap use really was. Some argue it was limited to monasteries and the wealthier classes, while others say even peasants used homemade versions, albeit sparingly. Archaeological digs have uncovered soap moulds in surprising places, but whether that means regular use or just occasional fumbling is still up for grabs. One thing's certain, by the late Middle Ages soap production had become a legit industry. The fale had begun to evolve. Now for something slightly unhinged, some medieval soap was made with urine. No, really. Human urine contains ammonia, which is a powerful cleaner. So in some areas, pee was collected, aged like a fine wine, and added to laundry soap for an extra punch. And if you're wondering who had the job of gathering that, congratulations, you've identified the worst gig in the medieval gig economy. Let's bring it back to you. Imagine standing in your one-room cottage, a pot of foul-smelling goop bubbling in the hearth. Your shirt smells like the inside of a horse stable, and your hair has developed its own structural integrity. You pick up a bar of homemade soap. It's lumpy, brown, and weirdly sticky. You sniff it. Bad choice. You wash your hands with it anyway, then decide, good enough. And that's your entire hygiene routine for the week. maybe the month, but you feel better afterward. Lighter, cleaner, slightly less haunted. You might not know the science, but something in your brain goes, this is working. And even if your soap burned a little, even if it left behind streaks and didn't lather like a modern commercial, you've taken the first clumsy step toward personal hygiene. So next time you're lathering up with your coconut vanilla tea tree bar in a steamy shower, remember, it took hundreds of years, countless chemical burns, and possibly a bucket of fermented pee to get you here. That little bar of soap in your hand? It's a victory lap for every medieval peasant who tried not to smell like an open wound and mostly failed. You're standing on the deck of a creaky ship, salt crusting your lips and the wind clawing at your hood. In your gloved hand is a gleaming brass disc covered in etchings, sliding parts, and symbols that look like they belong in a puzzle box. This, you've been told, is your key to navigation, the mighty astrolabe. It's supposed to guide you across oceans, calculate the stars, tell you the time, and maybe even impress your friends. It is, without question, the most high-tech device you've ever held. And it's also completely useless if you don't have a PhD in 14th century geometry. Astrolabes are beautiful, don't get us wrong. They're like the Rolex of medieval instruments, only more complicated and way less waterproof. Developed from earlier Greek and Islamic tools, the medieval astrolabe was a blend of astronomy, art, and a whole lot of guesswork. The idea was simple. You line it up with the stars, and it tells you your latitude, the time of night, or even when to pray. The reality? Most people had no clue how to use them. Navigators pretended. Monks squinted. Students cried. They came with rotating plates, star charts, scales, and tiny pointers called aliduds. Basically a full-blown medieval dashboard. And every region had its own custom design. So if you left home, your shiny little sky calculator might suddenly become as helpful as a rock. Imagine trying to use a calculator where the number keys are all in Latin, and only work if you're standing on a hill facing Jerusalem. That was the astrolabe experience, and yet people kept building them, selling them, writing long, tedious treatises on how to use them. Some universities even taught astrolabe classes, which were about as fun as getting excommunicated from a geometry club. People revered them not just as tools, but as symbols of intelligence and prestige. Owning one was a flex. Using it correctly, that was wizardry. Now here's the twist. Astrolabes didn't really help sailors as much as we like to think. Sure, they worked in calm weather. But picture trying to measure the angle of a star while your ship heaves, the deck tilts 30 degrees, and your stomach turns inside out. Scholars today debate whether mariners even used astrolabes at sea, or if they just kept them tucked away for show. More often than not, the real work was done with simpler, more rugged tools like the crossstaff or eventually the sextant. But the astrolabe, it looked fantastic hanging from your belt. There's also the weird little fact that medieval astrolabes weren't always used for navigation. Some were built purely for horoscopes. That's right, you could use one to chart your zodiac sign, predict a good day to harvest wheat, or decide if today was the day to finally propose to Beatrix. The same tool that could theoretically tell you your latitude was also consulted to see if Mercury was in retrograde. Multitasking, medieval style. But the real legacy of the astrolabe lies in how it shaped our approach to information. It taught people to see the universe as something you could measure, calculate, and graph. Even if the results were wildly inaccurate, the mindset stuck. The astrolabe failed as a practical navigational tool but succeeded in embedding scientific thinking into culture. It's the original, this looks complicated so it must be smart device. You know, like half the gadgets in your junk drawer right now. Fast forward to today, and you're still using its ghost. Every time you open a weather app, glance at a GPS, or look up a sunrise time, you're benefiting from the math the astrolabe almost managed to do. Astronomers, engineers and coders have all borrowed from its layout. Even modern analog computing tools and star tracking apps owe a debt to its logic. So yeah, it failed at sea, but it paved the way for space. Here's your quirky side note. Some surviving astrolabes were engraved with tiny prayers, protective symbols, or outright curses. One famous model includes a Latin warning, "Let him who steals me die horribly." Medieval Apple AirTag, basically, and people took it seriously. Imagine a sailor being afraid to borrow your device because it might bring divine wrath if mishandled. Let's not forget the scholarly bickering. There's still debate over who really invented the first astrolabe. Some say it was the Greeks, some credit Islamic astronomers, and others argue for Indian mathematicians. What's agreed on is that by the time it got to medieval Europe, it was already too complex for most users. That didn't stop them from making it even more complicated, like taking a 10-step recipe and turning it into a 40-page manifesto on stew. So now, back to you. It's night. The stars are out. Your ship creaks with every wave. You pull out your precious astrolabe, line it up with the North Star, squint, adjust, calculate, and realise you forgot which scale to use. Is it the outer ring? The inner one? Was that a 45-degree tilt or 135? The ship lurches. You drop it. It hits the deck with a metallic clunk. You sigh. The stars don't help. But somehow, deep down, you feel wiser just for having tried. And that's the strange thing about medieval tech. Even when it didn't work, it still taught people to think, to wonder, to chase precision. That brass circle in your hand. It failed its practical test, but passed the philosophical one. You're watching a candle. It's not just flickering, it's counting down your life. This isn't just wax and flame, this is timekeeping in the Middle Ages, the mighty and deeply flawed hour candle. Elegant in theory, laughably unreliable in practice. The concept is simple. Mark intervals on the candle, light it, and as it melts past each mark, voila, another hour gone. Medieval efficiency at its finest. If you're in a vacuum, with no breeze, and absolutely no plans for the next 6 hours. Hour candles weren't just tools, they were time itself, melting slowly on your workbench or altar. Some had metal balls embedded at intervals so they'd clink into a tray when the wax dropped, like a low-tech chime reminding you to pray, work, or stop overcooking your soup. Some even came with coloured wax layers, making time visible, a gradient of urgency from soft white to ominous crimson. A medieval lava lamp with anxiety. But here's the kicker. They didn't work. Not reliably, anyway. Everything affected them. The shape of the candle, the thickness of the wick, the air in the room. A draft from the door could speed it up. A colder chamber could slow it down. And heaven help you if your cat brushed against it, or you used poor quality tallow. One mark might burn in 10 minutes, the next in 40. An hour, according to the hour candle, could mean just about anything. It was medieval time jazz, interpretive and definitely offbeat. Still, people clung to them. Why? Because the alternatives were worse. Water clocks froze, sundials didn't work indoors or at night, and church bells, while dramatic, weren't exactly precise. So the candle, as fussy and inconsistent as it was, gave you something tangible. You could watch time pass, feel it melt, smell the faint aroma of beeswax and soot as your deadline approached. That physicality, it made time real, heavy, drippy. Of course, not everyone used them to tell time, some just used them to show off. Candles were expensive, especially the good ones. Owning a thick marked candle with metal inlays was like having a Rolex that sort of told the time but mostly screamed, "I'm rich enough not to care." And let's be honest, most peasants told time the old-fashioned way. Sun's up, get to work, sun's down, go to bed, rooster crows start it all again. There's a wonderful fringe fact here. Some monasteries developed elaborate candle systems to regulate prayer. Different colours for different times of day. Some monks even tried scenting candles so they could smell what time it was. Imagine associating 2 a.m. with frankincense and existential dread. The problem was that mixing herbs into wax often made the candle burn unevenly, defeating the entire purpose, but a plus for effort, right? And there's a debate among historians. Were our candles ever meant to be precise, or were they more like approximations, just close enough to keep monks from praying too early, or servants from slacking off too long? Some believe the candle's role was more symbolic than scientific, a meditative reminder of passing time, a flame-lit memento mori. After all, what's more medieval than tying your schedule to something that disappears right in front of you? Yet like so many of these beautifully bad ideas, the hour candle left a mark. It led to the notion of segmenting time into manageable pieces. It turned time from something abstract into something you could literally hold and ruin. It paved the way for sand glasses, which in turn inspired mechanical clocks. In other words, your smartwatch can trace its lineage back to a lumpy wax stick that once misled a monk into thinking it was lunchtime 3 hours early. And get this, people are bringing them back. The meditation candle industry is booming. You can now buy handcrafted candles with embedded hour markers, sold not as timekeepers, but as tools for mindfulness. Light one for your journaling hour, your yoga practice, your phone detox, all without the pressure of actual minutes. So the hour candle, once laughed out of the monastery for being completely untrustworthy, has reinvented itself as your modern-day stress relief accessory. Talk about a glow-up. Imagine yourself back in that cold stone chamber, the only light coming from the flames slowly swallowing its way down the wax. You've got no watch, no bell, no ticking sound, just a flame and a gut feeling that you're either 5 minutes early or 30 minutes late. You tilt your head, watching the next metal bead hover in the melting pool. Will it drop? Will it hold? Who knows? But for now, this tiny flickering stick of unreliable light is the most important object in your world. And you wouldn't trade it for anything. Because in a world where most things are chaos, the hour candle offers a kind of soft certainty. Even if it lies gently. You're sitting on a wooden stool in a low-ceilinged room that smells like damp wool and old hay, and in front of you is a contraption that looks like someone tried to weaponize a bicycle wheel. This is the spinning wheel, version 1.0, a medieval innovation that promised to transform the textile industry, and for a moment actually seemed like it might. Then it didn't. Then it did, centuries later, after a few painful upgrades. Welcome to one of the slowest moving revolutions in history, literally. In theory, the spinning wheel should have changed everything. Before it, turning wool or flax into thread was done with a spindle and distaff. Tools so basic they hadn't changed since ancient Egypt. You'd sit for hours spinning by hand, twisting fibre into usable thread one painstaking inch at a time. Enter the wheel, a rotating frame with a spindle that could be powered by hand or later by foot, allowing fibre to twist and wind into thread much faster. In concept, it was genius. In practice, the early spinning wheels were fussy, prone to tangling, and slower than the hype suggested. See, the medieval version lacked a critical feature, the treadle, that little foot pedal that lets you keep both hands free while the wheel turns. The first models required one hand to spin the wheel itself, manually, while the other tried to control the fibre, which was about as easy as patting your head and rubbing your stomach while riding a unicycle. Skilled spinners could make it work, but most people found it exhausting, especially over hours of use. You'd think it would double output. It didn't. At best, it made the process a little less boring. Still, the idea took hold. The spinning wheel, as flawed as it was, symbolised progress. Households and villages began to adopt them, especially where textile production was part of the economy. But even then, thread made from wheels wasn't as consistent or strong as spindle-spun thread. Weavers complained, tailors complained, your shirt kept falling apart, and yet spinning wheels stuck around. Because hope dies last. Here's a fun, slightly tragic twist. The foot-powered treadle didn't become widespread in Europe until the 16th century. That's right. Centuries after the first spinning wheels appeared, someone finally thought, hey, what if we used our feet instead of just one awkward hand? That innovation changed everything. Suddenly, spinning wheels did boost productivity dramatically. But until then, it was just a slightly more expensive way to do the same old task, with a higher chance of breaking something. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Spinning wheels were often given as wedding gifts, symbolising domesticity and womanly virtue. Because nothing says romance like, here, spend the rest of your life making thread until your fingers fall off. In some regions, girls began learning to spin as toddlers, with toy wheels made of wood and string just to prepare them for their lifelong relationship with yarn. It was less dream big and more spin forever or freeze in winter. Historians debate where the wheel actually came from. Some credit India, where early charkers were used to spin cotton, Others point to China or the Middle East. What's clear is that Europe took its sweet time adapting the idea, and an even sweeter time improving it. The delay wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Many textile guilds resisted the wheel, fearing it would flood the market or devalue hand-spun thread. So in some towns, spinning wheels were outright banned or heavily regulated. The textile equivalent of vinyl purists rejecting the MP3. But despite the drama, the wheel never really vanished. It just kept evolving. By the Industrial Revolution, spinning wheels were supersized into monstrous machines like the spinning jenny and the water frame, machines that could do in minutes what once took a woman a week. And yet the shape of the old wheel lingered in popular imagination. Fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty immortalized it. So did cottagecore Instagram feeds. Even now, spinners and fibre artists keep the tradition alive, only with modern treadles and polished wood and YouTube tutorials that don't involve marrying at 14. Here's a quirky modern echo, the fidget spinner, that tiny stress-relieving device everyone was obsessed with for a few months. Yeah, it traces back, symbolically at least, to the same obsession with rotating motion, tactile rhythm, and pointless productivity that the spinning wheel embodied. Your ancestors spun wool to survive the winter. You spin plastic to avoid checking your email. Circle of life. Now picture this. You, hunched over a medieval wheel trying to coax a clump of sheep fuzz into smooth, even thread. Your wrist cramps. Your fibre snaps. The wheel squeaks like a rat being exercised. And still, you try again. Because every foot of thread is warmth. Every spool is trade. Every tangled mess a chance to do better. You work slowly, and the world moves slowly with you. And somewhere, deep in the whir of that wheel is the sound of progress. Not fast, not dramatic, but real. A flawed machine that didn't quite work but changed the future anyway. You're galloping across uneven medieval terrain on a horse that's only slightly more agreeable than your mother-in-law. And strapped to your boots are a pair of small, gleaming metal instruments that someone swore would make you look heroic. Spurs. Specifically, knightly spurs, symbols of chivalry, power, and status. They also happen to be the reason you're slipping sideways in the saddle right now, because despite centuries of symbolic glory, medieval spurs were often more of a fashion statement than a functional tool. In short, they were the kind of upgrade that looked cool in paintings and got you thrown off a horse in real life. Let's talk basics first. Spurs were meant to help control a horse with precision. Press the side, the horse speeds up, angled differently it turns. But the early medieval versions, they weren't finely tuned instruments. They were brutal little spikes or wheels stuck to your heels, designed to jab, prod, and basically annoy your mount into moving. And not just any spur, oh no. The real knights wore the rowel spur, a spinning, jagged wheel of iron or brass that looked more like something you'd find on a sawmill floor than riding gear. Elegant, right? Problem is, horses don't particularly like being stabbed, especially not repeatedly by someone who barely knows what they're doing. Add in the fact that stirrups weren't standardised yet, and saddle design was hit or miss, and what you had was a perfect recipe for accidental rodeo moments. One too hard jab with a spur and suddenly you're airborne, face first into the mud, while your horse books it toward the horizon. Still, spurs became a big deal. Knights were dubbed into knighthood by receiving their spurs, sometimes even gold-plated ones. Entire ceremonies revolved around them. People talked about earning your spurs the way modern folks talk about getting their first company credit card. Big milestone. Never mind that the spurs themselves often failed to serve their main purpose. They weren't really for the horse. They were for you. Or more accurately, for how others saw you. In fact, there are records of men wearing spurs even when not riding horses, walking through court with them clinking dramatically, like medieval cowboy cosplay. Some went for absurd lengths, with elongated spurs that jutted out several inches behind the boot. Try climbing stairs in those without spraining an ankle, and yes, people tried. Some failed gloriously. Here's a quirky footnote, pun fully intended. Spur injuries were surprisingly common, not to the enemy, but to the rider. Stories abound of knights jabbing themselves in the calves, tripping over their own spurs or getting caught in tapestries while dramatically entering great halls. There's even evidence that some tournament regulations banned extra sharp spurs because of the number of accidents. So essentially they were dangerous to everyone except your opponent. Now here's the scholarly debate. How effective were spurs really in medieval combat or riding? Some historians argue they were barely more than decoration, especially once you reached higher nobility. By the late Middle Ages, skilled riders had trained horses that responded to voice or weight shifts. Spurs became backup tools at best. Others argue they were essential, especially in battle, to communicate urgency in the chaos of war. Either way, the fact remains. They were often more symbol than substance, and yet, somehow, they've survived. Spurs didn't die out with chainmail or feudalism. They made their way into cowboy culture, into rodeos, into military dress uniforms. Today, spurs are still awarded ceremonially in some armies. Modern riding spurs exist too, lighter, safer, better designed, but the legacy is unmistakable. Those jingly, overly dramatic heels stuck around. Weirdly enough, spurs also slid into fashion, literally. You can find spur-inspired heels on runway shoes, designer boots with decorative rowels, a nod to a time when looking like you could ride into battle was more important than actually doing it. And don't even get us started on cowboy films. Half those spurs don't do anything except make cool sounds when people walk into saloons. So let's bring it back to you. Imagine yourself in a cobblestone courtyard, tightening the last strap of your borrowed armour, your spurs glinting in the late afternoon sun. You feel confident, regal, slightly dangerous. You mount your horse, which flinches at the clink of metal, and for one glorious moment you are the image of chivalry. And then your spur catches on the stirrup, your boot twists, and you tumble sideways in front of the entire village. But you looked amazing on the way down, and that in a nutshell is the medieval spur, a failed product that didn't always work as advertised, caused more bruises than bravery, and yet somehow carved out a permanent place in our cultural imagination. Because sometimes it's not about what works, it's about what says it works. And nothing says, I'm a big deal, quite like tiny weapons strapped to your ankles. You're standing behind a wooden wall taller than a house, mounted on giant wheels, creaking as it lumbers forward inch by painful inch. It's covered in damp hides to keep it from catching fire, manned by dozens of shouting soldiers, and slowly, very slowly, being pushed toward the stone fortress ahead. You're inside a siege tower, one of medieval warfare's boldest, most expensive, and most frequently useless ideas. Congratulations, you're now part of the worst real estate dispute in history. The concept behind the siege tower was deceptively brilliant. Build a mobile armoured platform tall enough to match or overtop a castle wall. Fill it with archers, ladders, and angry guys with swords. Roll it up to the enemy's doorstep, lower a drawbridge, and storm the ramparts. In theory, it's medieval parkour with a blueprint, but in reality, it's like trying to deliver pizza with a house strapped to roller skates. First, these things took weeks, sometimes months to build. You had to construct them close to the battlefield, often in plain sight of the enemy, which means while you're sawing wood and hammering nails, the defenders are lobbing flaming arrows, dropping rocks, and shouting very personalised insults. Then there's the problem of moving the tower. On level, dry ground, maybe you could get some momentum. But medieval battlefields weren't built for smooth travel. Mud, ditches, slopes, and sudden terrain changes meant your glorious war machine often stalled, tilted, or just flat out collapsed under its own weight. And yet rulers kept ordering them. Kings, generals, barons with delusions of grandeur. Everybody wanted a siege tower in their arsenal. Because despite the logistical nightmare, the idea was irresistible. A moving fortress, a way to outclimb the unclimbable. Even when they failed, siege towers made a statement. We have resources, we have patience, and we're definitely going to burn your house down. Eventually. But here's the awkward part. Most siege towers didn't actually reach the walls. They caught fire, broke down, or were rendered irrelevant by smarter tactics. Defenders would flood the approach with water, making the ground too soft to roll across. They'd dig pits, booby-trap the path, or just focus all their firepower on the slowest, loudest, tallest target on the field. Some towers never even left the staging area. Others tipped over mid-roll, crushing their own troops in a slow-motion disaster that would have gone viral if medieval TikTok existed. Want a quirky footnote? There are documented cases of defenders capturing siege towers before they reached the wall, climbing aboard them from above and using them as makeshift forts inside their own castles, like watching a burglar break in, then handing them the deed to your house and moving into their van. There's even one record of a tower being seized, flipped around, and used against the original attackers. Medieval Uno reverse card. Still, siege towers weren't always epic fails. On rare occasions, very rare, they worked. The Romans, centuries earlier, had better luck using them thanks to their obsessive planning and slightly more forgiving terrain. And during the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders managed to roll up siege towers and breach the city walls. But those victories were exceptions, not rules. In most medieval conflicts, they served more as psychological warfare than tactical advantage. Big, dramatic, intimidating, and about as effective as a cardboard tank. Now here's the debate. Were siege towers truly military tools or theatrical props? Some scholars believe they were never really meant to succeed, just to scare defenders and drain their morale. Others argue they were part of a broader siege ecosystem, used in tandem with catapults, tunnelling, starvation tactics and bribes. A distraction, not a silver bullet. Which makes sense, because when your plan A involves rolling a 3-story wooden box uphill under enemy fire, you better have a plan B. And yet the siege tower lives on. Not in modern warfare, but in pop culture. Every fantasy film, video game and tabletop campaign has at least one scene where towers roll dramatically toward castle walls while fireballs explode in the background. They're iconic, instantly recognisable. Functionally useless, yes, but visually spectacular. And that's the legacy, an utter failure that still made it into the final cut. Fast forward to your world, office cubicles, mobile food trucks, pop-up exhibits, all oddly reminiscent of siege towers. Portable spaces that show up, make a scene, and then awkwardly try to leave. It's the same energy. And don't even try to convince me that rolling your suitcase through a crowded airport doesn't feel a little like pushing a siege tower into enemy territory. So here you are again, inside the tower. It sways with every bump in the ground. The wood groans. Your hands are blistered from pushing. Arrows thunk into the outer walls, and someone above shouts that the roof is starting to smoke. You're 10 feet from the fortress, then 5, then 2. The drawbridge slams down and catches on the parapet. Too short. Everyone groans. One guy throws up. You all look at each other and realise once again that this beautiful, ambitious, colossal structure has achieved exactly nothing. And yet, you'll build it again. Because the idea is just too good to give up. You're crouched beside a shelf in a dimly lit apothecary, shelves crammed with vials of strange colours, dried herbs tied in bundles, and jars containing things that really shouldn't be in jars. A thin man with 3 teeth and an air of deep confidence hands you a pot of greenish sludge and says it'll balance your humours and draw out the rot. What's inside? Bread mould, moss, maybe a bit of lard, and if you're lucky, not a toenail. This is your cure, your salvation, your medieval antibiotic, and it's going to fail spectacularly. In the age before germ theory, medicine was a beautiful, chaotic guessing game. Disease came from imbalanced humours, bad air, or demonic possession, depending on who you asked. So when people started getting clever with mouldy mixtures and fermented plant goop, it wasn't exactly science. It was trial, error, and a pinch of, maybe this won't kill me. And yet, those half-rotted concoctions, they occasionally worked. Not consistently, not well, but just enough to keep the idea alive. Welcome to the messy, mouldy prequel to penicillin. Let's talk about the recipe. Medieval antibiotic treatments often included mouldy bread applied directly to wounds. Yes, like a sandwich pressed to your leg. Why? Because mould was seen as a kind of natural cleanser. Not based on microbial understanding, of course, but because it looked like it was eating the infection. In some cases it actually helped. Certain moulds do produce antibacterial compounds, but without knowing how or why, the effectiveness was a cosmic coin toss. Sometimes it healed, Sometimes it festered, sometimes you died smelling like a bakery dumpster. Of course, the use of mould wasn't limited to bread. Physicians and healers also used damp moss, crushed herbs, and fermented grains. There's evidence of wound dressings soaked in wine or vinegar, which, surprise, have mild antiseptic properties. But they were rarely used correctly or consistently. You'd apply one mixture on Tuesday, a leech bath on Wednesday, and goat urine compress by Friday. It wasn't healing, it was alchemy with consequences. Now let's take a step back and appreciate the unintentional genius here. Medieval healers didn't know what bacteria were, but they stumbled into the neighbourhood. They figured out that certain materials seemed to make wounds worse, while others sometimes made them better. Over time, those lucky guesses piled up. By the time real antibiotics appeared in the 20th century, they weren't starting from zero. They were walking a path paved by centuries of mouldy bread and herbal misfires. Still, let's not give too much credit. Most of these treatments were catastrophic failures. Applying mould to open wounds without cleaning them properly? Bad idea. Using the wrong kind of mould? Worse. Some mixtures included quicklime, which burned the flesh. Others were stored in containers made of lead or pewter, leaching heavy metals into the already questionable cure. If the disease didn't get you, the treatment just might. Here's a particularly bizarre fringe fact. In some regions, people believed that the more disgusting a medicine smelled, the more powerful it was. So you'd have jars of curative muck fermenting for months in the back of an apothecary, growing new life forms while hopeful customers dabbed it on infected limbs. Some records even describe physicians recommending rotted pig fat as a base for healing salves. Imagine being so desperate you willingly coat your skin with decomposing bacon. Welcome to Healthcare Medieval Edition. And yet, here comes the debate. Some historians argue that these treatments weren't entirely without merit. They point to trial records, healing accounts, and rare cases where patients survived thanks to some funky bread poultice. Others dismiss the whole practice as quackery with a lucky streak. What's not disputed is the human instinct at work, the refusal to accept suffering without trying something, even if that something was mould and hope held together by beeswax. Now fast forward to your world. You have antibiotics that work, mostly, pills that kill bacteria, creams that close wounds, injections that stop infections before they start, and still, people are circling back. Natural remedies, fermented cures, ancient herbal knowledge, it's all trending again. Bread mould has been reborn as penicillin. Vinegar is sold in fancy glass bottles with labels like immune support elixir. You can buy moss-based skincare products for $70 an ounce. Congratulations, you're full circle. Imagine yourself back in that apothecary, staring at a crusty brown jar labelled wound cure, best before last full moon. You take a sniff. It hits you with a wave of sour yeast and regret, but your arm's infected and your options are limited. You dip your fingers into the slop and smear it over the cut. It stings. It smells. It probably won't work, but you don't have anything else. And if you're lucky, really lucky, this batch might be the one that helps. That's the strange legacy of these medieval antibiotics. They failed, again and again, but they failed in the direction of something bigger, of real medicine, of science, of learning. They taught people to observe, compare, and improve, even if the journey began with a slice of stale bread and a prayer. You're standing in a medieval field surrounded by the kind of tension that only occurs when both sides are just waiting for someone to blink or reload. You've got your hands on a hand-cranked crossbow, and you're feeling pretty good about it. It's sturdy, intimidating, and technically capable of piercing armour. The only catch? You've got time to make a sandwich between shots. Welcome to the paradox of one of the Middle Ages' most terrifying yet totally inefficient battlefield gadgets. The crossbow had one job: shoot a thick, short bolt with enough force to drop a knight in full armour. And when it did shoot, it was a monster. The draw strength on some models could exceed 1,000 pounds, making them lethal at short and medium range. But that power came at a cost. Reloading it was a logistical event. With smaller crossbows, you could pull the string back with your hands or a belt hook. With the really powerful ones, though, you needed a winch or a crank, called a cranaquin, to draw the string back slowly, groaning and clicking as the metal arms resisted every inch. This is not something you do under pressure. The average reloading time for a heavy crossbow, anywhere from 30 seconds to over a minute. That's 60 full seconds of standing there, cranking your little gear system while the guy with a longbow next to you fires off 5 arrows and checks his texts. In a battlefield scenario, especially once melee combat broke out, the crossbow user had one real chance to make their shot count. After that, they'd better be good with a dagger. But despite the slowpoke performance, medieval armies kept using crossbows. Why? Because they were democratizing. Unlike longbows, which took years to master, a crossbow could be taught in an afternoon. Point, crank, fire. Repeat slowly. This meant that even poorly trained foot soldiers could pose a threat to knights, which changed the dynamics of warfare and annoyed the nobility to no end. In fact, the Catholic Church banned the use of crossbows against Christians at one point. Not because they were ineffective, oh no, but because they were too good at levelling the social playing field. When a peasant with a crossbow could drop a noble with decades of training and thousands of coins in armour, it sort of ruined the chivalric vibe. So the church ruled them unfit for Christian conflict, which is code for "this makes rich people nervous." Of course, crossbows weren't just military. They were also hunting tools, tournament favourites, and occasionally murder weapons. The portability and power made them ideal for shady business. Assassins loved them. So did bored nobles who wanted to shoot at things without breaking a sweat. There are even court records of crossbow-related accidents during hunts that sound a lot like accidentally pushing someone off a balcony in a locked-room mystery. Want a quirky twist? Some crossbows were decorated to absurd levels. Gold-inlaid stocks, carved bone handles, filigree on the crank handles, literal warbling monuments to overcompensation. These weren't weapons. They were status symbols that happened to be able to puncture lungs. You didn't just show up to a duel with a crossbow. You showed up with your crossbow, imported from Italy, made with mahogany, and engraved with your family crest. Because if you were going to take 90 seconds to reload, you might as well look good doing it. Now, here's the scholarly debate. Was the crossbow's slowness a fatal flaw, or just a misunderstood trade-off? Some historians argue that in defensive scenarios, on castle walls in sieges, or in tightly controlled lines, the reload time didn't matter as much. Others say it was the reason longbows continued to dominate in open field battles like Agincourt. What's undeniable is that crossbows stuck around for centuries, even surviving into the early gunpowder era. They just couldn't be trusted in a rush. And weirdly, they're still with us. Not in actual combat, obviously, but in hunting, sport, and the imagination. Crossbows have seen a massive resurgence in pop culture. Think Daryl from The Walking Dead, or nearly every fantasy RPG character who's too cool for a bow and arrow. They're the perfect visual blend of archaic and menacing. And toy versions? Flying off shelves? Kids may not know how to crank a real one, but they'll absolutely ambush their siblings with foam darts and a smug grin. So imagine yourself back in that muddy clearing. You've just loosed your one glorious bolt. It whistled through the air, struck something important, and now all eyes are on you. You duck, crouch, and start cranking. Slowly. Painfully. Click, click, click. The noise alone could get you killed. You're halfway through, and already someone's charging at you. You could drop the weapon, run, switch to a sword. But no, you believe in this cranky piece of history, and as you fumble your way to readying another shot, you're keeping alive a tradition of impractical brilliance. A weapon that failed to keep pace, yet somehow endured anyway. On walls, in museums, in blockbuster movies. The hand-cranked crossbow didn't win the war, but it definitely won the aesthetic. You're standing in front of a merchant's booth in the middle of a bustling medieval fair, eyeing what might be the most confusing pair of shoes you've ever seen. They're leather, yes, but the toes are separated, pointed, curled up like a ram's horn. These are shoes with toes, the fashion statement that absolutely no one asked for, but that somehow refused to die. You slip your feet into them, instantly regretting it, and begin to understand how a product can completely fail in practicality, and still walk all the way into the future. Let's be clear, medieval footwear had some hits. Sturdy boots for travel, soft leather slippers for indoors, basic sandals for monks who liked to keep things biblical. But then came the poulain, the trend-setting, foot-distorting disaster of the 14th and 15th centuries. These shoes featured elongated, absurdly pointed toes, sometimes stretching up to 24 inches beyond the actual foot. That's 2 feet of shoe on a foot that already ends. You needed ankle strength, grace, and an absolute lack of concern for your own mobility to wear them. Why would anyone do this? Status, of course. The longer the toe, the higher your rank, or at least your self-esteem. Nobles strutted through courts with tips so long they had to tie them to their knees with little ribbons to avoid tripping over themselves. That's not just inconvenient, that's a whole performance. Imagine trying to flee a burning castle while your shoelaces are literally holding your feet to your thighs. Meanwhile, in the streets, people with slightly less ambition wore split-toe shoes, where the big toe was separated from the rest. It gave the illusion of having prehensile feet, or maybe goat hooves, depending on the design. Were they more functional? Barely. But they caught on in some circles, especially among artisans and tradesmen who needed a bit more control when climbing, gripping, or working in tight spaces. Still, it didn't stop people from tripping over uneven cobblestones or getting their toes soaked every time it rained. Here's the thing, these shoes didn't work. The poulain was fragile, got caught on everything, and collected dirt like a broom. The split-toe designs offered minimal protection and aged poorly, but fashion doesn't care about your blisters. The more outrageous the design, the more people noticed. And in a world without Instagram, you had to make every stroll through town square count. Now for your fringe fact of the night. Poulains got banned. Multiple times. Different kings and city councils issued laws restricting the length of shoe tips. Some limited them to 6 inches. Others banned them outright for certain classes of people. The church condemned them as vain and unholy, possibly even linked to demonic symbolism because of their hoof-like appearance. That's right. Your stylish shoes might have been considered evidence of satanic fashion, which, if we're honest, only made them cooler. Historians still argue about the practicality angle. Were these shoes entirely decorative, or did they serve some subtle ergonomic function in certain trades? Some say they helped balance riders in stirrups, or allowed more flexibility in tight indoor spaces. Others think that's giving too much credit to what was clearly just the Middle Ages version of a 6-inch stiletto. Stylish? Maybe. Comfortable? Not even a little. But here's the kicker. Modern footwear hasn't let go of this idea. Take a stroll through any avant-garde fashion show and you'll see the ghost of the poulain reincarnated. Long pointy dress shoes, cloven-toe boots, split-toe sneakers from high-end designers that look like ninja socks on steroids. Even the infamous toe shoes for runners, the ones that separate each toe like a glove for your foot, owe something to this strange medieval legacy. They may be better engineered, yes, but the core idea is still the same. Form over function, weirdness over logic, and the constant human urge to make your feet do something extra. And if you think this all ended in the Middle Ages, think again. Platform shoes of the 1970s, clownishly long dress shoes of early 2000s fashion, the sharp square-toe dress shoes still lingering in discount outlets. We've never really stopped making our shoes weird. We've just swapped rawhide and goat leather for synthetics and branding. So now picture yourself walking through a muddy medieval town in your brand new, knee-tied poulains. You can't run, you can barely walk, you trip on a stone, you try to turn sharply and your shoes argue. A goat looks at you with pity. And yet, people stare. You've made it. You are the moment. You're wearing the foot equivalent of a limousine, and nobody can take that away from you. Except, maybe, a city guard enforcing the anti-poulain ordinance. And the best part? They'll remember you. Not for your speed, not for your agility, but for your commitment to footwear so impractical, it became legend. That's how a shoe can fail and still leave a footprint in history. You're staring at a book. Not just any book, but a massive, hand-copied, leather-bound medieval manuscript that smells like dust, candle smoke, and anxiety. It's chained to the desk, literally. And not with some dainty, polite ribbon either. We're talking a thick iron chain bolted right into the spine. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval manuscript locks, where people took "don't touch my stuff" to a whole new level. These early anti-theft devices were janky, temperamental, and frequently broke. But somehow they were the precursors to every password, passcode, and locked screen you've ever cursed at. Let's set the scene. Books in the Middle Ages were rare and wildly expensive. Each one could take months, or even years, to create. You weren't just scribbling notes. You were preparing parchment from animal skins, mixing ink from soot and wine sediment, and writing everything by hand with a quill that frayed every 10 minutes. And after all that, your precious book could just walk away. Maybe not under its own power, but definitely tucked into the robes of a wandering monk with sticky fingers. Enter the lock. There were several methods. The most common was the chained library system, where books were literally chained to shelves or desks to prevent removal. You could read it. If you stood right there and bent over the table at a 45-degree angle, feeling your lumbar spine slowly disintegrate. Want to check it out for the weekend? Too bad. The chain doesn't go that far. Want to sit in a cosy window alcove and enjoy a leisurely read. Not unless your neck is made of iron. But that wasn't enough for the real bibliophiles. Some books were outfitted with actual locks and clasps, complete with tiny keys or even combination mechanisms using rotating metal discs. These proto-passwords were designed to keep the unworthy out and the precious knowledge in. And they mostly failed. Why? Because they broke constantly. Metal parts rusted, keys were lost, combinations were forgotten, and sometimes the locks just jammed, turning priceless manuscripts into extremely heavy paperweights. Still, people loved the idea. Locked books became a status symbol. They said, "What I know is so valuable, I'm willing to booby-trap it." Monks, alchemists, scholars, they'd all commission locks, even if the actual content was just a list of fish prices or a very judgmental sermon. Some libraries even had lockable chests with compartments for each book, so you'd open one lid and be greeted with a row of chained and locked tomes, like a treasure chest full of homework. Now for a slightly unhinged fringe fact. There are recorded instances of curses written into books to protect them. Not metaphorical curses. Real, ink-on-parchment threats promising divine wrath if you dared to steal or damage the contents. One famous curse reads, "If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him." Which, to be fair, is more aggressive than a padlock and definitely more entertaining. Of course, these locks didn't prevent theft entirely. People still stole books. They just got better at breaking chains, bribing monks, or copying the valuable parts and leaving the original. In time, scholars began debating whether the locks did more harm than good. Some argued they restricted access to knowledge. Others said they were essential for preserving texts in a world where one fire, flood, or careless scribe could erase a century of work. And then there were the realists. Locks or not, someone's going to ruin it anyway. Fast forward to today, and you can still feel the legacy. Think of the digital locks we now use. Passwords, biometrics, facial recognition. Most of them work about as well as those old clasps. How many times have you reset a password? Fumbled a fingerprint scan? Glared at your phone when it failed to recognise your face because you just woke up and looked like a medieval goblin? It's the same problem, just with better UI. In fact, medieval manuscript locks were an early signal of something very modern: information security. People wanted to control access, protect intellectual property, and prevent tampering. And just like today, they often overcomplicated it. The more elaborate the system, the more likely it was to break or be forgotten. Ever met someone who can't open their own diary because they forgot the lock code? Now picture that, but with an irreplaceable book written in Latin. Let's bring it back to you. You're in a musty scriptorium, the only light coming from a low candle that's dripping wax onto your tunic. You reach for a manuscript you desperately need, only to find it's chained to the desk. The clasp won't open. The key's missing. You jiggle it. Nothing. You mutter a prayer to St. Jerome. Still nothing. Somewhere in the distance a monk snickers. Your deadline looms. And there it is. Knowledge. Right there. Locked away by a mechanism no one remembers how to use. And you wonder, is it better to protect information or to share it freely? The medieval world wrestled with that question just as much as we do now. Their locks rusted. Ours glitch. But the struggle is the same. because when it comes to guarding what we know, we never quite get it right. We just keep trying. You're standing behind a thick wooden wall, nervously chewing on a strip of dried beef, when a booming crash shakes the earth beneath your boots. Dust rains from the ceiling. Men shout. Somewhere nearby, a terrified goat sprints into a barrel. You grab your helmet and rush toward the commotion just in time to see it. A massive arm of timber swings forward like a battering ram on steroids and launches a huge stone straight over the castle wall. Welcome to the world of trebuchets, medieval warfare's ultimate flex, and perhaps the most dramatic failure-to-function ratio in siege history. Trebuchets were the superweapons of the pre-gunpowder age. Tall as houses, long-armed, counterweight-powered monstrosities, they could hurl projectiles hundreds of feet through the air with terrifying force. Stones, burning pitch, barrels of sewage, or, on a particularly unhinged Tuesday, a whole dead cow. If you wanted to make an entrance, a trebuchet was your opening act, and the first several rows definitely got splashed. The principle was simple: a heavy counterweight on one end of a long arm, a sling on the other. You load your ammo, release the mechanism, and physics does the rest. The stone arcs up, flies toward the enemy, and in theory hits something important. In practice, well, medieval math wasn't exactly precise. The stone might hit the wall, it might fall short, it might fly right over and crush someone's garden. Sometimes, the whole machine misfired, launching the arm in the wrong direction or flinging the projectile straight into the ground like a really angry potato. But none of that stopped people from building them. Because when trebuchets did work, they were horrifyingly effective. Castles collapsed, morale shattered, soldiers scattered. There's something primal about watching a 40-pound rock sail through the sky and punch through a stone tower like a medieval wrecking ball. Even if you missed, the psychological damage was delicious. That said, trebuchets had issues. First off, they were a pain to build. Each one had to be constructed on site using local wood and materials. No prefab siege kits here, and they were massive. Some took weeks or months to finish. During that time, the enemy could do a lot. Reinforce the walls, dig moats, send out raiding parties, or just spend every waking moment trying to set your half-built death machine on fire. And don't get too attached. Trebuchets were high maintenance. The ropes would snap. The beams would crack. Counterweights needed to be calibrated just right, or you'd end up lobbing your ammunition straight into the trench in front of you. One unlucky crew even had their machine collapse mid-launch, flattening half their engineers in an act of treacherous irony. It was as if the trebuchet decided, you know what, you go flying today. Despite the design flaws, rulers loved them. Kings, barons, warlords, they all wanted their own mega-flinger. There are records of monarchs competing over the size of their trebuchets, like some kind of siege weapon beauty pageant. Edward I of England famously had one built during the siege of Stirling Castle that was so big the defenders tried to surrender out of sheer terror. His response? I just finished building it. I am using it. He launched a few shots for show before accepting the surrender. Because what's the point of having a trebuchet if you don't get to flex it? Now for a delightfully weird fringe fact. Some trebuchets were used to launch propaganda. Not leaflets, mind you, but the heads of captured enemies, diseased corpses, and once, allegedly, a messenger who refused to leave. The message was clear: surrender, or we'll keep throwing your friends over the wall. Medieval diplomacy was very literal. Here's where the scholars start bickering. Was the trebuchet the ultimate siege weapon, or just a really over-engineered intimidation tactic? Some argue its destructive power was overrated. Castles could often take dozens of hits before showing real damage. Others point out that just forcing defenders to cower in towers for days on end gave attackers a crucial edge. Either way, the trebuchet was rarely a clean win. It was one of several siege tools used in tandem. Think of it as the main event in a very messy festival of war. And even though the trebuchet didn't survive the gunpowder revolution, its image sure did. It's practically required in any medieval-themed movie, show, or game. Gamers build them in strategy games. High school physics classes build mini-versions. YouTube engineers create car-sized replicas to fling pumpkins across cornfields. There's even a modern cult status around the trebuchet. with memes praising it as the superior medieval siege engine. Catapults? Please. That's trebuchet slander. So picture yourself again on that muddy field, standing next to your towering, creaking masterpiece. You've wound it, loaded it, calculated your trajectory using some charcoal scribbles on a plank. You yell, "Fire," and pull the release. The arm swings forward, the sling releases, and the stone soars majestically into a tree 20 feet to the left. Everyone groans. Someone swears. A bird explodes. You reload. Because for all its flaws, the trebuchet feels like progress. It's big. It's loud. It's science with a side of destruction. And even if it doesn't always hit the mark, it makes a hell of an impression. You're in a cloud of buzzing. Not the gentle, lazy kind that makes you think of summer fields and honey. No, this is the frenzied, angry buzz of bees, and they are inside your helmet. Welcome to the chaotic world of early beekeeping gear, where the theory was sound, protect yourself from stings, but the execution, catastrophic. Picture an outfit so flawed that it not only failed to keep bees out, but sometimes trapped them inside with you. In short, congratulations, you're a walking, humming panic attack. Beekeeping wasn't new to the Middle Ages. People had been harvesting honey for centuries, but medieval Europeans began formalizing the practice, building structured hives, writing guides, and, crucially, trying to invent protective equipment. Early attempts at beekeeping hoods were, at best, speculative. They usually involved thick fabric hoods or masks, often stuffed with padding or stiffened with wire, with a mesh or cloth face covering. Problem was, ventilation wasn't exactly on the design checklist. You'd throw on this heavy, suffocating veil, stumble out to the hive, and within minutes be drenched in sweat, half blind, and breathing your own carbon dioxide. And let's talk visibility. These veils were often made from dark linen or fine iron mesh, neither of which aged well. After a few uses they sagged or rusted, leaving you squinting into a swarm like a beekeeper wearing a potato sack. Combine that with the muffled hearing, the restricted movement, and the intense heat, and you've basically turned yourself into the most vulnerable creature in the apiary. The bees, understandably, took advantage, but the real issue? The gaps. Early helmets weren't sealed well. Stitched fabric over rough tunics, open collars, loose sleeves. Bees would crawl in through your cuffs, your neck, even the folds of your hood. Once inside, they couldn't get out, and neither could you. You'd be out in the meadow, surrounded by swarming insects, screaming and spinning like a maypole dancer possessed by demons, all while trying not to crush the queen. The gear meant to protect you had become your own buzzing coffin. So why did people keep trying? Because honey mattered. It wasn't just a sweet treat. It was medicine, preservation, trade, and wealth. Sugar was rare and imported. Honey was the local gold. Beekeeping gave monasteries economic power, peasants supplemental income, and lords another source of prestige. Everyone wanted in, so they kept inventing, kept tweaking, kept trying to find that one design that would let you harvest honey without becoming an accidental human pincushion. Here's a fringe detail for your dreams tonight. Some beekeepers believed the bees could smell fear. So not only were you dressed like a scarecrow going through a midlife crisis, but you were also supposed to stay calm. No sudden movements, no yelling, just gentle murmurs and slow gestures, while the bees crawled across your face and investigated your eyelids. If you panicked, you were taught they'd strike. Some monks even fasted before visiting the hives, hoping to smell less aggressive. Nothing says meditative self-control like getting stung in the lip while chanting psalms. And yet, weirdly, the core idea stuck. Even though early hoods were failures, the concept of a protective veil persisted. Over time, the gear evolved. Cloth gave way to structured mesh, drawstrings to elastic bands, and eventually full-body suits with zippered seals and reinforced gloves. The medieval beekeeper walked so that the modern one could strut calmly into a hive, face shielded, body sealed, confidence intact. But the legacy doesn't stop at apiaries. Today's hazmat suits, deep-sea diving gear, even astronaut suits all owe something to that basic design problem. How do you protect a squishy, anxious human from an environment that wants them gone? The answer began, awkwardly, painfully, with those first buzzing hoods and slapstick field fails. Here's the scholarly question that still buzzes around. Sorry. How much of this early gear was actually used, and how much was just theoretical? Some historians believe most medieval beekeepers just didn't bother with protection and relied on smoke and experience. Others suggest the hoods were used, but not by everyone, maybe reserved for elite beekeepers or ceremonial use. The problem? Bees don't care about your social class. Now picture yourself standing in a grassy meadow, a wicker hive smoking gently at your feet. You lift the lid, your veil sagging into your line of sight, hands trembling as bees surge up in a golden swarm. One finds the gap at your collar, then another. You freeze. You try to hum a soothing tune, but it comes out more like a panicked bleat. They crawl along your neck, wings brushing your skin. You pray they don't sting. One does. On your chin. You drop the frame, trip backward and crash into the bush behind you. And yet, next week you'll do it again. Because the honey is worth it. The trade is worth it. The dream of gear that actually works is worth it. Failure by failure, sting by sting, you're helping push the idea forward. So next time you drizzle honey into your tea or spread it on toast, remember, someone once nearly died in a field wearing a sack on their head just so you could have that sweetness. You're walking through a castle courtyard just after a rainstorm, the stones slick and the wind biting at your ankles. Around your shoulders billows a thick, heavy cloak, the sort of flowing garment that's supposed to scream nobility, mystery or wizard in training. And for a moment it does. You look dramatic, cinematic, absolutely composed. Then you turn too quickly and the hem snags on a loose cart axle. You spin, your balance gives, and you land in a puddle. That, in a nutshell, is the story of the medieval cloak. Gorgeous in theory, ridiculous in practice, and yet, still here. Cloaks were essential in the Middle Ages. They were your coat, your blanket, your umbrella, your portable tent. They came in wool, fur, silk if you were rich, and burlap if you were not. You could fasten them with brooches, pins, or just tie them at the neck where they choked you lightly with every gust of wind. They were symbols of status, function and drama all rolled into one itchy, soaking garment that did almost everything except perform the basic function of staying out of the way. Let's talk failure. For starters, cloaks were terrible in the rain. Most were made of woven wool, which while somewhat water-resistant would still absorb moisture like a sponge if soaked long enough. And guess what it did with all that water? It held on to it. A wet cloak could double its weight, dragging you down like a soggy anchor. Ever tried climbing stairs with 15 pounds of waterlogged wool wrapped around your ankles? Now imagine doing that while being chased. Then there was the length. Fashionable cloaks often trailed the ground, especially among the upper class. In muddy streets filled with horse droppings, spoiled vegetables, and the general mystery muck of medieval life, this was not ideal. You'd go out looking regal and come back with a hem dipped in everything. The fancier the cloak, the more likely you were to end the day looking like you'd been dragged behind your own horse. But hey, if you tripped over your cloak, at least you'd do it looking fabulous. That was part of the appeal. Cloaks were theatrical. They swirled dramatically in the wind, flared when you turned, and made even the clumsiest squire look like he might be hiding a sword or a secret. Knights wore them to court. Priests wore them to sermons. Assassins wore them to not be seen, which was ironic, since half of them dragged attention wherever they went with their rustling, oversized fabric sails. Want a weird detail? Some cloaks had built-in pockets on the inside. They were often used for carrying letters, tools, food, or occasionally stolen goods. Because when your entire outfit is basically a mobile tent, you might as well treat it like carry-on luggage. There are even tales of cloaks being used to smuggle animals, chickens mostly, under the folds. Which sounds cute until you remember chickens don't come with a mute button. And then there was the cape variant. Shorter, sassier, but just as flawed. Capes didn't offer much warmth, left your arms exposed, and offered zero protection in a downpour. But they looked sharp, especially with a little fur lining. People kept wearing them even when coats came into fashion because they were easier to throw on, harder to steal, and let's face it, gave off major, mysterious stranger energy. So why, if cloaks were so impractical, did they persist? Because they almost worked. They were simple to make, easy to layer, and could be adapted to different climates and classes. And more importantly, they told stories. A cloak wasn't just a garment. It was a statement. It said who you were, where you came from, whether you were worth talking to. The colour, the clasp, the cut, all carried meaning. Red for royalty, black for mourning, green for travel. Or if you were unlucky, brown for peasant, frayed for unlucky, missing entirely for probably dead. Here's the historian debate. Were cloaks really that common, or is our romantic image of them skewed by art and literature? Some argue that most medieval folks actually wore simpler tunics and coats for day-to-day life, saving cloaks for travel or special occasions. Others claim cloaks were standard outerwear, especially in northern climates. Either way, there's no denying they loom large in our imagination, thanks to centuries of poets, painters and directors who love a good slow-motion cape swirl. And boy, have cloaks stuck around. Superheroes wear them, fantasy protagonists wear them, stage magicians still can't get enough. Even modern trench coats and parkas owe something to the classic cloak, a big wraparound garment that tells the world you're going somewhere important, or at least pretending to. And yes, people still trip over long coats in real life. It's tradition. Picture this. You're making your way through a crowded medieval tavern, the firelight glinting off the pewter mugs and greasy plates. Your cloak catches on a bench. You turn, not realising it's hooked on the chair leg. The motion yanks the chair, tips the table, spills the ale, and suddenly 4 burly men are glaring at you while your cloak tries to strangle you mid-apology, and still you refuse to take it off, because in your heart you know this is the look. And maybe that's the point. The medieval cloak failed in half a dozen obvious ways. Trip hazard, rain sponge, wind sail, goat thief, but it succeeded in giving people a sense of identity. It failed as a piece of clothing, but thrived as a piece of character. You're walking down a cobblestone road and you hear it. Clink, clink, clink. A slow, rhythmic chime that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. You turn your head, and there they are. A pale, rag-wrapped figure hobbling toward you with a stick in one hand and a bell dangling from the other. They're not a town crier or a monk. No, this is a medieval plague victim, wearing what might be history's most depressing wearable tech, the quarantine bell. Its purpose? To warn everyone nearby that you're sick, possibly dying, and to please back away slowly while trying not to scream. These bells were the medieval version of a siren, an early health alert system, except instead of flashing lights and public service announcements, you got a mournful jingle and an overwhelming sense of doom. If you were infected with the plague, leprosy, or any other disease deemed contagious and terrifying, you were often legally required to carry a bell and ring it as you walked. Sometimes you wore it around your neck. Other times you held it in your hand or strapped it to your waist. The point was clear. You are now the problem, and everyone should know it. Of course the idea had some logic. Medieval cities were dense, dirty, and dangerously uninformed about how disease actually spread. People still believed in bad air, unbalanced humours, or divine punishment as the source of illness. So when someone started showing signs of plague, boils, fever, the general aura of doom, the best solution society had was to isolate them and make sure nobody got too close. Enter the bell. A warning, a barrier, and a mobile panic button all rolled into one. But here's the problem. It didn't really do anything. Sure, it warned people, but by the time you were ringing that bell, chances are you'd already been coughing, sweating, and breathing on people for days. And once the actual Black Death hit, those who rang the bell weren't out for a stroll. They were often near collapse, barely able to walk, let alone ring a tiny metal chime with any kind of consistency. In many cases, the bell became symbolic, a grim rattle to signal society's helplessness more than to prevent actual infection. Some people took it further, combining the bell with plague garments, like robes marked with crosses or hoods dyed in sorrowful black. In a few towns, infected people were forced to wear special outfits covered in sewn-on symbols, circles, patches, or even painted on skulls. It was like a medieval dress code for disaster. Add the bell and suddenly you're not just sick, you're a walking cautionary tale, a sad parade of failure in human form. And here's your fringe fact. In some areas, animals were also fitted with bells if suspected of carrying disease. Dogs, pigs, Even cats might have a tiny chime attached to signal their plague risk. The medieval world didn't fully understand vectors of transmission, but they sure knew how to turn every interaction into a jangling game of chance. And just imagine the sheer soundscape. Sick people, sick animals, wandering the streets, all jingling like a funeral choir that never ends. There's also a debate among historians. Was the quarantine bell truly widespread, or just practiced in certain high-anxiety regions during peak outbreaks? Some argue that the idea was more common in literature and lore than in actual street life, citing how few surviving bells have been found. Others point to city ordinances from places like London and Milan that explicitly required the practice. Regardless of how often it was enforced, the concept caught on and stuck in the collective memory, because the sound of a bell, no matter how soft, can carry a long, long way when it's tied to dread. And strangely enough, the idea survived. Not the bells exactly, but the principle, a public signal for private danger. Think of quarantine signs, health alerts, wristbands, even the do not enter signs on hospital doors. Modern tech may have ditched the handbells, but the basic medieval logic still clings. When someone's sick, make it loudly known. Even metaphorically, we still ring those bells. Red flags in relationships, trigger warnings on content. Every time we signal danger ahead, we're channeling the same instinct. Protect the herd, even if it means singling out the suffering. The ethics are murky, just like they were then. Now picture it. You, trudging down a narrow alley in a medieval town, the sky grey, the air heavy. You're holding the bell, the clapper tapping the side with each weary step. People peer from doorways and windows, recoiling, whispering, crossing themselves. The child cries, the dog barks, and you ring that bell again, not because it helps you, but because it protects them. Also, you've been told. It's lonely, it's humiliating, and it's heartbreakingly human. A failure of compassion disguised as public safety. And yet, even in this, there's something that lasts. That quiet jingle echoes across time, a reminder of how societies handle fear, and how fear shapes the way we treat the sick. Because sometimes, the bell wasn't just to warn others, it was to remind you that you were still alive. You're hiking through a sun-scorched stretch of countryside, sweat trickling down your back, throat dry as parchment. You reach for your water, and pull out a sloshy, semi-deflated animal bladder. That's not a metaphor, it's an actual bladder. From a goat, a sheep, maybe even a pig, cleaned out, tied off at the ends, and filled with precious water. Welcome to one of the most awkward hydration solutions the medieval world ever produced. The bladder bottle, a leaky, smelly, and utterly necessary failure that somehow echoes in every plastic hydration pouch hanging off a hiker's backpack today. Let's be fair, the idea was logical. Medieval people didn't have glass factories pumping out water bottles, or mass-produced canteens with little pop-top nozzles. You had to work with what you had, and what you had, often, was animal remains. Once the meat was eaten and the skin cured, the bladder, or sometimes the stomach, could be dried, scraped and sewn, or tied into a kind of flexible container. Waterproof? Kind of. Durable? Not especially. Sanitary? You don't want to know. These makeshift containers were used not just for water, but also for wine, oil, milk, and even ink. Their portability made them useful for soldiers, shepherds, travellers, and anyone living far from a clean, reliable stream. They were lightweight and mouldable, fitting nicely into saddlebags or being tied to belts. But here's the problem. They decomposed, quickly, and badly. Even when properly cleaned and treated with ash or salt, the organic material would start to break down after a few weeks of regular use. Some people tried to wax or resin coat the inside to prolong the life of the bladder, but even then the taste was, let's just call it earthy. And don't get too confident about the seal. These bladders leaked. Not always dramatically, but enough to ruin your day. The knots would come loose, the stitching would fray, or a sharp rock in your pack would poke a slow, soggy hole right near the seam. You'd reach for a drink and discover that your canteen had been slowly dribbling goat-scented wine into your bread for the last 3 miles. Still, this was the best they had. Wooden flasks were heavy, metal ones rusted, pottery was fragile and hard to carry. So if you were on the move and needed hydration, your best option was to fill up a gut bag and hope for the best. Some people even carried multiple bladders to separate drinks. One for wine, one for water, one for don't ask. It wasn't efficient, but it was functional enough to get by. Here's a fringe fact that might ruin your next hike. The condom as we know it also has roots in animal bladders and intestines. That's right. The same basic material used to hold your drinking water was also being repurposed for birth control. Two very different outcomes depending on how carefully you tied the knots. It makes you wonder if someone ever reached into the wrong pouch and had a very awkward dinner. Of course, historians debate just how common these bladder containers were. Some believe they were widespread, especially among rural communities and armies on campaign. Others think they were more of a last resort, used when better options weren't available. What's not debated is how they paved the way for better portable vessels. The basic principle, flexible, squishable, lightweight container, remained appealing long after the smell faded from memory. And sure enough, modern hydration packs like camelbacks or soft flasks used by runners and hikers rely on almost the exact same concept. Replace the pig bladder with BPA-free plastic, add a nozzle, slap a logo on it, and boom, you've got a product that traces its design DNA right back to some medieval farmer swishing fermented goat milk around in a stomach sack. It's beautiful, in a mildly nauseating way. So now imagine it. You're walking through a high mountain pass, fog clinging to the rocks, and you feel the familiar weight of the bladder bouncing at your hip. You untie the waxed end, lift it to your lips, and brace yourself. It tastes like warm wool and whatever herbs were growing near the animal's liver. But you're hydrated. For now, and that's enough. Until the knot slips. The bladder spasms, you fumble, a wet stream slaps your boot. You sigh, knowing you'll have to drink from a stream later, and hope the upstream village doesn't use it as their laundry pit. But in this moment, you marvel at the sheer grit it took to survive with tools like these. Not elegant, not convenient, just possible. Because that's what the bladder bottle represents. Making do, using what's at hand, innovating through necessity. It failed in every modern sense, durability, sanitation, taste, but it laid the groundwork for every step forward. You can mock the design, gag at the smell, but you can't ignore the ingenuity. And next time you uncap your triple-filtered, steel-insulated, mint-infused water bottle, just know you're sipping in the shadow of a goat's bladder. You're unrolling a parchment map across a wobbly wooden table in a flickering candlelit room, hands calloused, eyes squinting. The map is beautifully illustrated. Coasts inked with sea monsters, mountains rising like angry eyebrows, cities marked with gold stars. But there's one glaring problem. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. According to this 14th century masterpiece, France might be underwater. Jerusalem is somehow dead centre of everything, and there's a dragon swimming a few miles off the coast of Cornwall. Welcome to the often failed but fiercely imaginative world of early medieval cartography, where the maps were gorgeous, but your odds of actually finding anything were low. To be fair, medieval maps weren't always meant to be functional in the way we think of today. Many were symbolic, spiritual, or didactic, intended to teach or inspire, not direct someone from point A to point B. The most famous example, the Mappa Mundi, a type of medieval world map that looked like a flattened mandala had a fever dream. In these maps, Jerusalem often sits right at the centre, with Asia at the top, Europe to the bottom left, and Africa bottom right. That's not a mistake. It was theology, geography, meet religious doctrine. Now try to actually use one of these maps to go somewhere. Want to travel from Rome to Constantinople? Good luck. The scale's off, the roads are vague, and half the cities listed might not even exist anymore, or ever. Some rivers flow in the wrong direction. Coastlines swell and shrink like they're breathing. You'd be better off asking a pigeon for directions. And yet, these maps weren't treated as failures at the time. People loved them. They were status symbols, conversation pieces, and often works of literal art. The more elaborate the drawing, the more impressive the map, regardless of its navigational accuracy. And the decorations. Oh, the decorations. Early maps were less tool and more interactive medieval storytelling. Want to warn sailors about dangers at sea? Just draw a kraken eating a boat. Curious about far-off lands? Here's a guy with no head and a face on his chest. Or a dogman tribe with spears, or a camel with 2 heads. Medieval cartographers didn't have satellite imagery, but they did have rumour, hearsay, and a total lack of shame. So they filled in the blanks with myth, bestiaries, and occasionally naked people wrestling serpents. One of the more infamous features was the terra incognita, the unknown land. Rather than leave these spaces blank, mapmakers often labelled them with phrases like, "Here be dragons," or "uninhabitable due to monsters." It's the historical equivalent of putting /open parenthesis pipe character close parenthesis // on an official document. Not helpful, but strangely honest. And here's your quirky fact for the night. Some medieval maps were made with no intention of ever being read by travellers. They were chained to monastery desks, tucked inside royal libraries, or hung on cathedral walls as theological diagrams. These weren't tools for going places, they were cosmic mood boards, the kind of thing you'd stare at for hours, learning how God arranged the world, why paradise was placed in the east, and what sins might cause you to end up swallowed by a sea serpent. That said, not all maps were disasters. As the medieval period crept toward the Renaissance, Portolan charts began to emerge. More accurate coastal maps used by sailors, especially in the Mediterranean. These used compass lines, careful measurements, and surprisingly solid data. But for the average person, those weren't what you saw. What you got were either homemade scribbles or theological tapestries pretending to be Google Earth. Modern historians debate whether medieval maps should be judged by our standards or their own. Were they failures because they couldn't guide you to a specific village? Or were they successful because they captured how people saw the world, both physically and spiritually? After all, a map that puts heaven in the east and hell just off the bottom margin isn't trying to help you navigate terrain. It's trying to navigate your soul. And yes, modern maps still carry echoes of these beautifully broken originals. Political maps often distort scale for emphasis. Subway maps simplify reality into geometric shapes. Even fantasy novels love drawing sprawling dragon-riddled lands that would have made a medieval cartographer proud. You might laugh at the inaccuracies of a Mappa Mundi, but then open a game manual or fantasy atlas and see nearly the same layout, just with more elves. So now picture it. You're on horseback, pulling out your rolled-up map in the middle of a muddy crossroads. You try to find your location, but your town isn't on the map. The river you just crossed runs north on the page, and the forest you're headed toward is labelled haunted, do not enter. You sigh. You turn the map sideways. That doesn't help. You consider using it to start a fire, then remember it costs more than your horse. So instead, you do what every traveller eventually did. You fold it up, mutter a prayer, and ask a stranger for directions. Because no matter how decorative or divine a map may be, sometimes it just doesn't know where you are. You're standing in a candlelit chamber surrounded by velvet curtains, painted saints, and shelves lined with tiny jars of dried herbs, animal bones, and powdered something. A robed apothecary hands you a vial with a reverent look, whispering that it's ground unicorn horn, an elixir to cure plague, snake bite, poisoning, and presumably bad decisions. You take the vial, squint at its chalky contents, and realise 2 things. 1, it's wildly expensive, and 2, there's no way in heaven or hell that this powder ever belonged to a unicorn. Welcome to the glittering fraud of medieval unicorn medicine, a centuries-long, premium-priced failure that relied entirely on wishful thinking, mythical beasts, and the inability to identify a narwhal. Yes, the majestic unicorn, horned symbol of purity, grace, and impractical weight distribution, was once thought to be very, very real. And not just real, but medicinal. People believed that its horn, called an alicorn, had near-magical properties. It could supposedly neutralize poisons, detect toxins in food and drink, heal wounds, protect against disease, and, according to some bold salesman, cure everything except death itself. You can see why this was a hot item. Kings and nobles paid fortunes for alicorn. Monarchs collected them like holy relics. Some even kept them in elaborate display cases, like you might mount a sword or a championship trophy. They were ground into powder and sold in minuscule doses by apothecaries and charlatans alike. With prices so high they make modern snake oil look like a bargain bin item. This powder was often mixed into wine, sprinkled onto wounds, or added to candles to purify the air. Spoiler alert, it did none of these things. At best it was powdered bone. At worst, it was powdered something else entirely. So where were all these unicorn horns coming from, considering no one had ever actually seen a unicorn? Enter the narwhal, a real-life Arctic whale with a long spiral tusk jutting from its head like a unicorn cosplay accident. These tusks, harvested and traded by Norse and Scandinavian merchants, made their way south through trade routes, often sold to nobles as genuine unicorn horn, by people who were either very persuasive or very bad at biology. And it worked. Brilliantly, in fact. No one knew what a narwhal was, let alone where it lived, and certainly no one in a German or French court had ever seen a whale with a horn growing out of its face. So when a merchant showed up with one, carved and polished to look exotic and holy, people bought in. Literally. There are royal records of unicorn horn purchases so large they'd bankrupt a small country. The horns themselves became symbols of power and purity, often used in ceremonial cups for royalty. The belief was that if poison touched a unicorn horn, it would bubble, smoke, or shatter the vessel entirely. Some monarchs wouldn't drink from anything else. The irony, of course, is that any real poison poured into those cups went unchallenged. If you died, the apothecary would just claim you didn't use enough unicorn horn. Classic upsell. Here's a fringe fact. Some of these horns were actually made from walrus tusks, rhinoceros horns, or even carved cow horns soaked in vinegar to give them a twisty, weathered look. The entire industry was built on layered deception. Genuine narwhal tusks mislabeled as unicorn, and fake horns trying to pass as narwhal. It was fraud, built on fraud, packaged in mysticism, and sold as science. There's still scholarly debate about how many people actually believed in unicorns, versus how many were just playing along. Some historians suggest nobles and apothecaries knew the horns weren't real, but pretended anyway because belief was powerful, and powerful people didn't want to be seen doubting tradition. Others believed the faith was entirely sincere, bolstered by church teachings, travellers' tales, and manuscripts featuring highly imaginative illustrations of horned horses fighting lions or purifying streams with their faces. And yet, for all its failure, unicorn horn medicine managed to shape our understanding of pharmacology in bizarre ways. It encouraged the development of exotic imports as status-based remedies, inspired early efforts to catalogue and test mysterious substances, and led to increased scrutiny of counterfeit products, eventually helping build the scientific skepticism that birthed modern medicine. So while it didn't cure your plague, it did help cure our collective gullibility. Slowly. Today you can still see the relics of this failed miracle cure in museums. Massive horns, mounted behind glass, still labelled as unicorn alicorns, though now with a little disclaimer plaque that usually starts with "actually." And the unicorn? Still kicking around. On lunchboxes, fantasy novels, and Instagram filters. The belief shifted, not vanished. We stopped grinding the unicorn into medicine, but we never really stopped believing in it. So picture this. You're sick, pale, sweating, surrounded by the smell of rosemary and desperation. The apothecary hands you a pinch of shimmering powder, promising it's unicorn horn harvested from the Arctic Sea by monks with vows of silence and perfect aim. You swallow it, hoping for salvation. The pain doesn't leave, but you feel a little better. Not because it worked, but because you believed it might. And sometimes, belief, no matter how wrong, was the only medicine you had. You're in a cold stone chamber lit only by the guttering light of a tallow candle, and you're adjusting your jewellery. Not just any jewellery. On your finger rests a ring shaped like a skeleton, grinning up at you with empty eye sockets and tiny perfect teeth. Around your neck hangs a locket containing a lock of someone's hair, curled and pressed behind a stained glass panel no bigger than your thumbnail. This isn't a sign of mourning or rebellion. No, this is fashion. Medieval Memento mori jewellery, ornate, grim, and wildly popular among people who seemed absolutely obsessed with reminding themselves they were going to die. The phrase Memento mori, Latin for remember that you must die, was more than a slogan in the Middle Ages. It was a way of life, a vibe, a brand really. The idea was simple. No matter how rich, powerful or pretty you were, death came for everyone. So why not wear that reminder on your sleeve, or better yet your hand, neck or earlobe? These accessories were intended to keep your soul humble. Rings engraved with skulls, hourglasses and worms were popular among the clergy, aristocrats, and anyone who wanted to be both spiritually aware and extremely dramatic. Brooches bore phrases like omnia mors equot, death makes all things equal, or as I am now, so you shall be. It was Instagrammable content for the medieval soul, if your feed was full of plague art and minor saints being martyred. But here's the awkward part. The more these pieces became fashionable, the less they worked as moral reminders. What started as a sobering wake-up call gradually turned into a stylish flex. Nobles commissioned gold memento mori rings encrusted with rubies. Skulls were carved from ivory or mother of pearl. Lockets featuring tiny skeletons were worn not as cautionary tales, but as status symbols. You weren't exactly confronting your mortality when your death ring cost the equivalent of a farmhouse. And let's not forget the variety. There were coffin-shaped lockets that opened to reveal corpses, earrings shaped like dangling bones, entire rosaries carved from jet-black wood, each bead a tiny skull. You could walk into a cathedral looking like the Grim Reaper's fashion intern and still be considered tastefully devout. Here's a wonderfully weird fringe fact. Some of these rings weren't just worn by the living, they were made to be worn by corpses. Seriously, wealthy families would have death jewellery created specifically for their loved ones to wear in the tomb, a final accessory for your eternal dirt nap. It wasn't uncommon to open a crypt centuries later and find a perfectly preserved skeletal hand wearing a ring engraved with Memento mori, still grimly clinging to the finger bone like the world's least comforting friendship bracelet. The actual effectiveness of these trinkets is still debated. Did they really make people more pious? Or did they just offer a macabre aesthetic to people who, like us, enjoyed dabbling in doom while sipping something warm? Historians argue both sides. Some believe they played a genuine role in daily religious reflection, especially during times of plague and famine when death felt close enough to tap you on the shoulder. Others suggest they quickly lost their edge and became yet another symbol of wealth wrapped in virtue signalling. Either way, the trend survived. When the Black Death swept through Europe, Memento mori jewellery exploded in popularity. Suddenly, everyone was painfully aware of how quickly life could end, and everyone wanted a little bone-shaped reminder to help them process it. Death had become an accessory, literally, and it didn't stop there. By the time we hit the Victorian era, the aesthetic had evolved into full-blown mourning jewellery. Locks of hair braided into rings, portrait miniatures in black enamel, mourning brooches, mourning bracelets, mourning everything. The skeletons had gotten fancier, but the message stayed the same. You're not here forever, so maybe don't spend all your time yelling at your servants or hoarding bread. Today, Memento mori lives on, just with different materials. Gothic fashion, skull rings, tattoos that say, "Remember death," in elegant script. Even wellness influencers occasionally toss the phrase into their motivational posts, sandwiched between sun salutations and juice cleanses. And sure, we've swapped carved bone for stainless steel, but the spirit's still there. Aestheticise death. An attempt to make mortality palatable, maybe even chic. Picture yourself walking through a medieval market, cloaked in layers, hand on your sword hilt, fingers heavy with rings. One bears a skull, jaw hinged to open when pressed. Another has a glass dome over a carved skeleton. People glance at your hands, your pendant, and nod with recognition. You're not just wealthy, you're aware, you're sophisticated, devout, and just a little bit scary. Which is exactly what you were going for. Even if the ring doesn't make you kinder or more generous or any less likely to trip over your own ego, it still whispers the same truth. This won't last. And that whisper, that reminder, it's fashion's oldest, most haunting truth. wrapped in silver, etched in Latin, and dangling just above your pulse. You're standing at the edge of a crowded medieval market, trying not to inhale too deeply, because the air is thick with smoke, spoiled meat, and at least one mystery smell that has no earthly explanation. You're clutching a charm around your neck, a strange little pouch of the herbs, maybe a coin, maybe garlic, maybe something you don't even remember putting in there. You can't see the germs, no one can, but you've been told this charm will protect you from illness. It smells like regret and old onions, but hey, it's better than nothing. Welcome to the wide woo-woo world of medieval hygiene charms, where medicine, magic and superstition crash headfirst into each other in a cloud of fragrant failure. Let's back up. In a world without germ theory, the cause of disease was up for grabs. Was it bad air? Sin? A passing glance from a witch who didn't like your haircut? All were fair game, so people did what people always do when faced with invisible danger. They got creative. They made charms, talismans, necklaces filled with herbs, amulets carved with prayers. Sometimes just stuffing a clove of garlic into your tunic was considered cutting-edge medical science. It didn't stop the plague, but you did smell terrible enough that people did keep their distance, so maybe it worked in a roundabout way. These charms came in all shapes and levels of effectiveness. There were pestilence bags, tiny pouches filled with aromatic herbs like rosemary, lavender and sage. You'd wear them around your neck or tie them to your belt. Their scent was believed to ward off the miasma, or bad air, that carried disease. Some were worn under the armpits, others were stuffed into the folds of your hat. If you were fancy, your bag might be embroidered with protective prayers in Latin. If you weren't, you probably just carried a smelly rock and hoped for the best. Then there were charms blessed by clergy, crosses, relics, bits of parchment with saint names scrawled in ink made from wine and soot. These were thought to offer divine protection. Others went full pagan, using bones, beads or tokens carved with symbols from older belief systems. And of course, some people doubled up. Can't decide between garlic and Jesus? Wear both. You never know what's going to work until it doesn't. But let's be honest, most of these charms didn't do anything, except create a booming industry of healers and wise women who sold them at a markup. Still, they persisted. Why? Because they provided control. When your neighbour drops dead from coughing and your cousin turns purple overnight, having something, anything, you can wear or touch or smell that tells your brain I'm safe now, is worth more than gold. These charms weren't just items, they were comfort. And comfort doesn't have to be effective to be powerful. There's a wonderfully weird fringe fact here. Some hygiene charms were so pungent that animals avoided people who wore them. Stray dogs wouldn't come near you. Rats would give you a wide berth, which, if you think about it, was probably the best possible outcome. After all, rats were plague carriers. Maybe the charm didn't ward off illness directly, but it created a scent-based buffer zone that accidentally served a useful purpose. Medieval people failing upwards since forever. But not all charms were harmless. Some contained toxic materials like mercury, lead or arsenic, blended into powders or suspended in oils and worn in little glass vials. The thinking was that these strong substances could counteract equally strong diseases. In reality, they poisoned the wearer slowly and steadily, like a fashion-forward curse. There are recorded deaths of people who inhaled or ingested trace materials from their protective charms, so in trying to stay healthy, they fast-tracked their own funeral. Irony? Absolutely. But also a classic medieval move. Historians still debate whether people truly believed in the power of hygiene charms, or just wore them because everyone else did. Was it faith, peer pressure, habit? Maybe all three. Some argue that these objects had more psychological impact than physical, a sort of medieval placebo effect. Others point out that many of the herbs used do have antimicrobial properties, even if they weren't applied in ways that made any scientific sense. And of course, this kind of thinking didn't stay in the past. Look around today: essential oils, healing crystals, energy bracelets, copper-infused compression socks. People still seek comfort in items that promise protection, sometimes backed by science, sometimes just good marketing. The packaging is better now, the ingredients cleaner, but the human impulse? Exactly the same. So picture yourself weaving through a plague-ridden town, the air thick with incense and despair. You've got your charm tucked tight against your chest. You breathe in the sharp scent of rosemary and dried orange peel. A priest walks past swinging a censer. A woman in rags mumbles a blessing and spits twice for luck. You nod, comforted not because it makes sense, but because doing something feels better than doing nothing. And that's what these hygiene charms gave people. Not protection, not immunity, but a sense of action, of fighting back, of carrying just enough hope to get through the day. So even if all you were really carrying was garlic and wishful thinking, you're squelching through mud in full armour, dragging your boots out of what feels like the 100th swampy ditch of the day when you finally reach the outer edge of a castle moat. It's wide, it's dark, it smells like wet socks and disappointment. You glance across it at the towering walls, imagining the glorious battle ahead, but there's just one small problem. Your own guys just fell into the moat trying to cross it. Welcome to the frustratingly flawed history of the medieval moat. A feature that rarely worked as intended, often backfired spectacularly, and still somehow became the gold standard of high security imagery for centuries to come. Let's start with the concept. A moat sounds genius in theory. Dig a wide trench around your castle, fill it with water, and now your enemies have to swim or build something just to get close. Brilliant! Impenetrable! Wet! But the reality, more complicated. First, not every castle had access to a river or a natural spring, so filling your moat often required redirecting streams or hauling water manually. In dry seasons, moats dried up. In winter, they froze over. Suddenly, your elite water barrier is now a mud pit, or worse, a convenient ice bridge directly to your front door. Some moats weren't even filled with water at all. They were dry moats, just deep trenches meant to break up cavalry charges and funnel infantry into kill zones. But again, sounds better on parchment than in practice. Dry moats filled with debris, collapsed during storms, or became perfect hiding places for attacking forces. In one notable siege, soldiers actually used a dry moat to sneak right up to the walls unnoticed, essentially turning the castle's greatest defence into a free front row seat to the attack. And here's the kicker. Moats didn't just inconvenience enemies, they routinely inconvenienced defenders. Hauling supplies over a drawbridge was tedious. Crossing the moat during emergencies was chaotic. One flaming arrow aimed at your wooden bridge, and suddenly the only exit to your own fortress is ash floating on water. And if your defenders were unlucky or drunk, they could end up falling in during the night watch, drowning in what was basically a glorified puddle filled with algae and regret. There's a charmingly gross fringe fact about moats. Some were used as waste disposal systems. That's right, sewage, garbage, animal carcasses, all dumped into the moat. The thinking was that not only did it save trips to the dump, but it made the moat extra uninviting. After all, who wants to wade through 6 feet of sludge and rotten cabbage to breach a wall? It was like medieval psychological warfare by way of compost. But it also made your own fortress smell like the armpit of Satan on laundry day. Not a great trade-off. Despite all this, the moat endured, not because it always worked, but because it looked like it should. A castle with a moat felt secure. It sent a message. We're not just rich enough to build giant walls, we're rich enough to dig giant holes around them. Moats were a status symbol as much as a defence system. In some cases they were purely decorative, especially later on when castles turned into stately homes. Still water, swans, and no actual purpose beyond impressing the neighbours. Peak medieval suburban energy. Of course, historians have plenty to say about moats. Some argue that they were part of an overall strategy, slowing attackers long enough for archers to do their work. Others insist moats were more about optics than outcomes, especially when sieges increasingly involved undermining, literally digging under your walls, or cannons that laughed in the face of a water trench. As gunpowder weapons improved, moats became less relevant and more ornamental. By the Renaissance, they were more likely to host ducks than danger. But the moat lives on, in metaphor, in fantasy, in home security brochures that promise to moat your digital life against hackers. Kids still draw castles with moats in crayon. Video games let you dig moats around pixelated kingdoms. Theme parks and modern mansions use them to imply luxury. The idea of the moat, the fantasy of it, is stronger than its actual performance ever was. That's legacy through branding, not functionality. So now picture yourself standing at the edge of that waterlogged trench, your armour streaked with grime, your patience thinner than your wool socks. Behind you, someone shouts that the drawbridge mechanism jammed. In front of you, enemy troops are already setting up ladders on your side of the moat because they found the dry patch near the corner. You sigh. The moat didn't stop anyone, it just gave them something to splash in on the way in. And still, when the war is over and the castle rebuilt, someone will suggest adding another moat. This time, they'll say, we'll dig it deeper, wider, maybe even add spikes or crocodiles. And you'll nod, because even though it failed, the moat still feels like safety. Sometimes the illusion of protection is almost as powerful as the real thing. You're hunched over a wooden writing desk in a cold scriptorium, fingers ink-stained, your candle sputtering, and your entire job, your one job, is to copy a single text, line by excruciating line, without error. A monk coughs in the corner, the wind howls outside, your eyes blur, you blink, you miscopy a word, and now the sentence reads like heresy. Congratulations, you've just contributed to the beautiful, agonizing, and frequently error-filled world of medieval manuscript reproduction. A system so labour-intensive, so wildly inconsistent, and so incredibly vital that it's both a miracle and a total failure of efficiency that any of the knowledge survived at all. Before printing presses, everything had to be copied by hand. That meant every book, every scroll, every map, every scientific treatise had to be transcribed, usually by monks, sometimes by scholars, occasionally by bored teenagers with questionable Latin. These scribes laboured for months or even years on a single volume, hunched over vellum, parchment made from animal skin, with quills trimmed to cruel precision. And even with all that effort, mistakes were guaranteed. Text might be skipped because the scribe's eyes jumped from one line to another. Words were sometimes misread, misunderstood, or outright replaced with phrases that made more sense to the copier. If a page got smudged, damaged, or just confusing, future scribes might gloss over the issue with a helpful marginal note like, "This part is unclear," or, more commonly, "Probably wrong, but oh well." Some of these scribes even left delightful passive-aggressive commentary in the margins. One monk scrawled, "Oh my hand," another wrote, "Thank God, it will soon be dark." And yet, despite these imperfections, the handwritten manuscript was revered, not just as a vehicle for information, but as an art form. Illuminated manuscripts, those lavishly decorated with gold leaf, miniature paintings, and ornate initials, were status symbols. A single illuminated Bible could cost more than a house, but even the plain texts, scribbled in cramped script without illustrations, were treated like treasure, because they were. Books were rare, paper was a luxury, literacy was power. To own a book was to wield influence, political, religious, intellectual. Still, let's not pretend the system worked smoothly. Sometimes monks copied from translations of translations, introducing layers of distortion. A Greek text might be translated into Arabic, then Latin, then back into Greek, like a game of telephone hosted by exhausted polyglots. The results could be wild. Whole chapters got jumbled. Important details vanished. One scribe, trying to translate a word that meant ship, interpreted it as house. That book described a seafaring journey aboard a very confused cottage. Here's a deliciously weird fringe fact. In some monasteries, scribes were told to copy manuscripts while fasting to avoid bodily impurities affecting the spiritual content. Yes, you were expected to transcribe complex theological texts on an empty stomach, shaky hands and all. Unsurprisingly, this sometimes led to fainting, hallucinations, or, let's say, creative liberties with the margins. Some scholars still argue about just how unreliable these manuscripts were. Optimists point out the incredible consistency across certain major texts, like copies of the Bible or Aristotle's works, where careful comparison reveals only minor variations. Others argue the sheer number of errors, interpolations, and corrections in surviving manuscripts proves how shaky the whole process was. What's undeniable is that copying by hand created a messy living record of human effort. Flawed, but persistent. And it's worth remembering that even these failures left a legacy. The struggle to preserve knowledge by hand built the foundation for the printing revolution. When Gutenberg's press arrived in the 15th century, it didn't replace manuscripts overnight, but it did start to clean up the mess. Standardization, reproducibility, fonts that didn't cough or get hungry. But those early printed books, they mimicked the look of handwritten manuscripts because people didn't trust the new style yet. Old habits die hard, especially when they're written in Latin on calfskin. And honestly, the romance of the manuscript never really died. Bookbinders still recreate them. Digital artists mimic their illuminated letters. Fantasy worlds are packed with dusty old tomes and ancient grimoires. Even modern note-taking apps use medieval-style fonts when they want to evoke mystery or wisdom. Our collective memory still loves the idea of the wise old monk copying secrets by candlelight, even if, in reality, he was mostly muttering, "Oh no, not another genealogy list." Now picture yourself back at the desk. Your back aches. Your ink is drying up. You dip your quill again, refocus, and carefully begin the next line. You're not just copying letters, you're preserving the very shape of human knowledge, and maybe, just maybe, you insert a tiny doodle in the corner, a rabbit with a sword, a snail fighting a knight, a joke that only you will understand, because even in a broken system beauty survives. And in between the errors, the ink blots, and the endless repetition, someone, you, left behind a trace of humour, of self, of life. And that's what makes it all worth copying. You're standing in a forest clearing, eyes scanning the trees, heart pounding against your ribs like a war drum. In your hands, a crossbow, the medieval answer to what if we made a bow but angry. It's heavy, clunky, and takes forever to reload. You've practiced with it, even managed to hit a cabbage from 20 paces once. But now you're facing something that actually wants to kill you, and suddenly you're realizing the brutal truth. The crossbow, while revolutionary, was also kind of a hot mess. Let's get one thing straight. The crossbow should have been perfect. It was easy to aim. You didn't need years of training like a longbowman did. You just pointed it, pulled the trigger, and let the bolt fly. It was medieval plug-and-play warfare. The bolts could punch through chainmail at close range, sometimes even plate armour. Peasants could be trained to use one in a week and suddenly pose a legitimate threat to knights who'd spent their whole lives practicing how to not die. And yet, for all its promise, the early crossbow failed in all the most inconvenient ways. First, reloading. Unlike the elegant, fast-paced longbow, a crossbow required time. Serious time. You had to brace it against the ground, hook the string with a lever or crank, called a windlass, and slowly pull it back into position. This could take up to 30 seconds per shot. In battle, that's enough time for your enemy to reload, aim, fire, insult your haircut, reload again, and shoot you twice more before your crossbow's even ready. Not to mention the weight. These things were heavy. Add the windlass, a quiver of bolts, and maybe some chainmail, and you're basically carrying a small siege weapon on your shoulder while trying not to fall over. And if you dropped it, good luck realigning the trigger mechanism in the middle of a battlefield with muddy fingers and an arrow sticking out of your boot. And here's a spicy fringe fact. The crossbow was so controversial that the church tried to ban it. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council declared the crossbow hateful to God, particularly when used against Christians. Why? Because it was too effective, too easy. It made warfare impersonal. You didn't need to look your enemy in the eye or have any noble skill. You could just crank, aim, and kill. It felt unfair, undignified, especially to the knights who were suddenly vulnerable to peasant weaponry. But despite moral outrage and practical setbacks, the crossbow stuck around. Armies liked them, especially when used en masse. A wall of crossbowmen could unleash a terrifying volley that forced even the most hardened knights to duck. In sieges, they were useful for picking off defenders from behind cover. They even found their way into naval warfare. Yet no matter how much they were refined, the fundamental problems remained. Slow reload, cumbersome build, and mechanical unreliability. Still, their legacy lingered. crossbows eventually gave rise to more advanced ranged weapons and laid the groundwork for mechanical triggers and firearm design. They influenced the way militaries thought about troop training, shifting the focus from lifelong mastery to battlefield efficiency. The idea that a commoner could pick up a weapon and level the field, that was revolutionary. Of course, modern folks have revived the crossbow in a different way. Today it's a favourite of hunters, hobbyists, and zombie apocalypse planners everywhere. Modern materials and technology have smoothed out the old flaws, composite limbs, lightweight frames, laser sights, but the medieval DNA is still there, humming quietly behind every click of the trigger. Now imagine yourself in the heat of a siege, standing behind the ramparts as enemy forces gather in the distance. You take your position, plant your foot in the stirrup, pull the string back with trembling arms or a windlass, carefully place the bolt and aim. Your fingers are cold. Your breath fogs in the air. You release the trigger. Thunk. A satisfying hiss cuts through the wind, and somewhere across the field someone stumbles. You've done your part. Then you look down, start cranking again, and realise it's going to be a long night. And yet, you wouldn't trade it, because the crossbow gave you a shot. Maybe not a fast one, maybe not a noble one, but a real one. It failed in ways that mattered, yes, but it succeeded in the way that mattered most. It changed the game. So now you're here, at the end of our winding, splintered road through the weird and wonderful world of medieval products that completely flopped, but left a mark anyway. You've worn the too long cloaks, downed the unicorn dust, swatted bees in your face-hugging hood, tried not to gag drinking from a goat's bladder, and prayed your garbage moat would keep the neighbours out. You've clutched charms that reeked like soup, marched with a jangling plague bell, and misfired a crossbow so slowly that your enemy had time to insult your aim and your haircut before striking back. And somehow, all these broken inventions, these earnest misfires, still echo in the things we use now. Your sleek water bottle, a cleaned-up animal bladder, your GPS app, the latest evolution of a map with sea monsters and no scale. Even your smart ring that tracks your heart rate might owe its soul, ever so faintly, to a skeletal Memento mori reminder that yes, you will die, so you might as well get your steps in. That's the beauty of failure, the glorious, muddy, bleeding edge of human trial and error. Medieval people didn't always get it right. Honestly, they rarely did, but they tried. And every lurching, leaky, illogical thing they built pushed the wheel of progress another inch forward. So tonight, as you drift off, remember this. Some poor soul once smeared garlic on their forehead and marched into the night, convinced it would stop the plague. That energy, that blend of hope, fear, and DIY survival instinct, that's eternal. Thanks for staying up with me. Turn off the lights, let the fan hum, and dream easy, knowing the world was always just a little bit weird and always trying to do better.